Chapter 494. Jing Jiu handed the green sky mirror to Gu Qing and said, "Take it to the 3,000 nunnery outside the Yuan city." After Jing Jiu lured the snow girl into the sword jail, Qing hadn't come out since. He thought that she had no interest in chatting with Gu Qing. This disciple of his was sometimes even more boring than him. Gu Qing took over the green sky mirror, feeling it was quite heavy. He had the same feeling back when he took over the inherited Heaven Sword Manual from Jing Jiu. He had the same feeling when Jing Jiu asked him to be the teacher of the Prince Jing Yao. He had the same feeling when Jing Jiu asked him to be the sect master of Aoyama. This was a magic treasure of the heavenly state. Why did my master trust me so much? Or was this another test for his disciple? Jing Jiu didn't pay attention to what was on Gu Qing's mind. "Let's go," he said to the crowd. Though it was an ordinary remark, the people of Shinma Peak knew him well enough to know that it was a solemn farewell for him. Zhao Liu came before him and hugged him. She held him for a while before letting go of him. Ping Yongka wondered if this was the courtesy of the people of Shinma Peak. Did he have to hug her as well? As he was thinking of this, he opened his arms reflexively, though his movement was a bit stiff. He didn't come back to his senses until Yuan Chu slapped him on the back of his head. He bowed to the ground with cupped fists like his two big brothers. Jing Jiu said to Gu Qing in the end, "I'd like to use the sword a bit more." Jing Jiu was a bit hesitant when making this decision. Gu Qing was startled, wondering why Jing Jiu had to ask him if he wanted to use the sword. And why did he hesitate? Jing Jiu was not a person like Jing Jiu. What had happened? The sword of the universe had appeared, making Shinma Peak even more desolate. Jing Jiu jumped up on the sword and turned into a streak of cold light, heading toward the high sky. The grand formation of Aoyama opened a passage naturally. The sea of clouds rippled, and the sword light faded away. Zhao Liu led Gu Qing and Yuan Chu into the cave. Ping Yongka was still standing at the edge of the cliff, waving to the sky. His face was full of reluctance, and his heart was full of anxiety. He had been at Shinma Peak for a year, but he had only met his master twice. They had not spoken more than 5 sentences. If this continued, what would happen if his master forgot that he had a disciple like him? "Get ready. We might have to go far," Zhao Liu said to Yuan Chu. Gu Qing was going back to Zhaoga City, so he wouldn't participate in this matter. As such, Yuan Chu had to take care of these affairs. Yuan Chu was a little nervous and asked about when. Zhao Liu thought that it would depend on when Jing Jiu could find that person. Apart from Zhao Liu, few people knew why Jing Jiu left Aoyama alone, let alone where he was going. Like what he had done several times in the past, the sword of the universe landed outside Cloudy Town instead of flying 300 miles away. In this aspect, his big brother and Zhao Liu had a great influence on him. The restaurant serving the hot pot was like a post station for the people of Shinma Peak, or a gathering place for them every few years. Jing Jiu pushed open the door and entered the restaurant, feeling displeased. The smell in the private room was terrible, filled with the stink of alcohol and the smell of the burning hot pot. Jing Jiu took off his conical hat and dropped a drop of water into the hot pot. Along with a sizzling sound, the temperature of the burning hot pot dropped a bit, but the smell grew stronger. Jing Jiu was taken aback, and then he called out the sword fire that he had practiced in the snowland for 6 years, burning the hot pot and everything in it into a puff of green smoke. The window was pushed open, and the wind and human voices poured in together, diluting the smell. Nan Wang was already drunk, so she felt even worse after being blown by the wind. She didn't know who Jing Jiu was, so she complained coquettishly, "I still want a drink. Why did you make the dishes disappear? Come back to me quickly." There were wine jars everywhere in the private room. There were exactly 15 of them. She could drink so much without using Zhen Yuan. She could be considered a good drinker in the human world, but it was obvious that she had drunk too much. Jing Jiu's expression didn't change, but he shivered a few times in his mind. Jing Jiu was most afraid of Nan Wang acting like a spoiled child after drinking too much, singing a tune, staring at him with wide eyes while not speaking, and vomiting all over his body. If he didn't need Nan Wang to find the person, he wouldn't have agreed to Lucy's arrangement to go with her. "It's time to go," said Jingjiao. Nan Wang glanced at him and seemed to remember who he was. She said drunkenly, "Why should we go? I just started drinking." Jingjiao felt helpless. He condensed a ball of water again and added some coldness to it, turning it into a mixture of water and ice. He smashed it directly on her face. Nan Wang cried out in surprise. Her body was wet, and her curves were even more graceful. Her face was wet, and her eyes were especially attractive. She was sober, and her eyes were very scary. Jingjiao silently handed over a handkerchief. Nan Wang silently took it and slowly wiped the water on her face. Finally, she took out a few pieces of ice from her half-open collar. Then she slowly raised her head and looked at Jingjiao, asking expressionlessly, "Do you want to die?" Hearing Aoyama's catchphrase, Jingjiao was silent. He was fully aware that Nan Wang had a bad temper. He wouldn't do such a thing if it were any other occasion. He would stay far away from her and wait for her to sober up. However, it was up to them to find Nan Shu when Aoyama would come out of the West Ocean. Time was indeed tight. Jingjiao, of course, wouldn't respond to her. Now that he couldn't defeat her, he didn't want to bring pain to himself. Nan Wang didn't think Jingjiao was obedient and sensible because of his silence. She got up and walked to the front of Jingjiao, reaching out her hand to grab his chin. It was then that a white figure appeared as fast as lightning and knocked her hand back. The expression in Nan Wang's eyes grew cold as she looked at Jingjiao's sleeve. She could see clearly that it was a cat's paw. A moment later, the white cat crawled out from Jingjiao's sleeve and climbed to his shoulder along his arm. As he was about to climb up to his head habitually, he suddenly thought that it would be a bit embarrassing for Jingjiao since there were other people around. As such, he squatted on Jingjiao's shoulder. "You have a backer. That's why you are so daring," Nan Wang said while staring into Jingjiao's eyes. Then, she turned to the white cat and said expressionlessly, "What is the master white ghost doing here instead of enjoying his life on the mountain?" The white cat turned his head around, unwilling to pay any attention to her. It was evident from the way she addressed him that she was very angry. Otherwise, she would call him Ada. Nan Wang was in the upper state of the Broken Sea, so she was no match for the white cat. However, women were a troublesome thing, and beating a woman would cause many other troubles. Nan Wang had always been the most troublesome woman in Aoyama. She was very daring because she was favored by the masters and big brothers. She dared to pull the white cat's whiskers when she was young, and she chased him everywhere when she was older. The worst part was that she didn't want to hold the white cat, even though she had such a good condition. She only liked to grab his neck, which was very uncomfortable. Zhao Liu was the best. The white cat began to miss the warm embrace he had felt after leaving the Shinma Peak not long ago. Then, he remembered that little Liu hadn't held him for a long time, feeling a bit resentful. Jingjiao explained, "The master white ghost is good at smelling things." The white cat was surprised, wondering what was going on today. Why was everyone calling him by his pet name? The reason Jingjiao didn't call him Ada was different from that of Nan Wang. It was not because he was angry, but because he didn't want Nan Wang to find out something from the way he addressed him. The horse-drawn carriage of the Gu clan had been waiting outside the restaurant for a long time. A few years had passed, and the carriage had been upgraded again. The design was more ingenious, and the craftsmanship was still perfect. It seemed that the Gu clan needed to charge the Gu clan for advertising their craftsmanship. The chairs that used to sit opposite each other were now a chair and a couch. It was obvious that the Gu clan thought that it was Zhao Liu who traveled with Jingjiao. Nan Wang supported her chin with her hands, looking at the spring scenery outside the window, thinking about something. She was as petite as the common barbarian girls in the south, and her legs weren't very long, but they still took up most of the space on the couch. Jingjiao sat on the floor without a second thought, closing his eyes and cultivating by meditation. The white cat couldn't help but climb up to Jingjiao's head, sighing comfortably and narrowing his eyes. Hearing the voice, Nan Wang spun her head and saw the scene. She couldn't help but let out a smile, showing a beautiful smile. The carriage entered Nanhezu and headed west. Sometimes it took the official road, and sometimes it took the mountain road. It would stop occasionally, but most of the time, it just kept moving. Every time the carriage stopped, there would be sword lights illuminating the mountains or pavilions, bringing the latest news. Near the Zhuang River, Nan Wang and Jing Jiao abandoned the carriage and started walking. Only on rare occasions, such as when the cliff was too high or the river was too deep, would they choose to ride their swords. The latest news continued to arrive along with the sword lights. In the blink of an eye, it was midsummer. A small boat floated on the lake in Daozhou City. Nan Wang sat at the bow of the boat, looking a little worried. He kept pouring wine into his mouth. Jing Jiao sat at the other end of the boat, stroking the cat's head with his right hand. He wondered when they would reach the end. The appearance of the sword lights and news seemed normal, but it was actually very difficult. During this period of time, at least 7,000 things that had just happened had been sent to them at the fastest speed for them to judge. This required the full cooperation of the curtain rollers, and many swordsmen in the undefeated state and above to be the postmen, and they couldn't alert the people at the West Ocean. Besides the Zhongzhou school and the imperial court, the Aoyama sect was the only sect in all of Chaotian capable of doing this. The Aoyama sect had demonstrated its resources and employed a great deal of resources and disciples, but they still had no idea what to do. Nan Wang was fully aware of what her mission was, so she was under a great deal of pressure. She was drowning her sorrows in wine, but she felt more and more depressed. All of a sudden, she saw Jing Jiao's face illuminated by the lake light and found a good way to relieve the pressure. "Come on, smile," she said. Jing Jiao was aware that she was drunk, so he didn't pay attention to her. This wine was the osmanthus wine provided by the Precious Tree House a few days ago. Though its name sounded gentle, it was actually the strongest and most fragrant wine in the world. It was impossible for someone like Nan Wang not to get drunk after drinking it, as if it were water. Gu Qing had told Zhao Lei that the owner of the Precious Tree House wanted a magic pill. He was present at the time and heard the request. Now the magic pill was gone. Seeing Jing Jiao ignore her, Nan Wang walked over from the other side of the boat with a wine jar in her hand. She was swaying unsteadily, as if she would fall into the lake at any moment, but she didn't. As she came to the front of Jing Jiao, she said arrogantly, "You're quite arrogant. Since you don't want to smile, how about a dance?" Nan Wang was the young sister of the Shanghai Depeak sect. She had been doted on since she was a child, and even the immortal Jing Yang couldn't do anything to her. As a result, she had developed a spoiled temperament. Now that she had left Aoyama, without the supervision of Yuan Qijing and the supervision of the younger generation, she behaved more recklessly. Jing Jiao didn't pay attention to her. He reached out to grab the white cat and was about to throw it at her. The white cat thought that this was unreasonable. How many years would his neck and this barbarian girl's would be at odds? At this moment, a carriage with a begonia flower engraved on it suddenly came from the woods by the lake. Before the carriage stopped, a doctor rushed out from inside, sweating profusely, and shouted, "Found it! Homophonic jokes and rustic rhymes. These two problems happened today, but they were really happy to write." Chapter 495. Nan Wang looked in the direction of the lakeside. It was merely a simple turn, but the drunkenness in her eyes had completely disappeared. Her body exuded the fresh and clean energy of the mountains. More importantly, she had become the peak master of Qingrong in Aoyama. The small boat moved forward through the waves without oars, creating countless splashes. Soon, it arrived at a place not far from the lakeside. Kneeling on the ground, the doctor held a file high in his hands, not daring to raise his head. Nan Wang reached out his hand and took the file. After skimming through it, he said to Jing Jiao, "We still have to go to Deer Mountain." Countless thin sword strings appeared on the surface of the lake, forming a net-like object. Nan Wang leapt up in the air and stepped on the surface of the net with his bare feet, heading toward the sky with a whoosh. In the next moment, the sword of the universe shot up into the sky. The surface of the lake rippled, and it took a while for it to calm down. Deer Mountain was a famous mountain in the southwest of Chaotian. Its fame came from the southern barbaric tribes. It was said that the godly temple where the southern barbaric tribes worshipped their ancestors was located on this mountain. Two sword lights landed in the valley. Nan Wang looked at the surrounding mountains and fields, remaining silent. She was the owner of this place, but she felt a bit unfamiliar since she hadn't been here for many years. And she felt a bit gloomy because of what had happened to Nan Chu. Nan Chu was of course not on Deer Mountain. If the curtain rollers could find him, Aoyama wouldn't be on such high alert. This was a clue that the immortal Lu Ci asked Shui Yu Nunnery to calculate using the heaven-human connection. She waved her sleeve, and the silver bracelet on her wrist clanked against each other, giving off a crisp sound. Hundreds of wild bees flew out from the flowering trees in the mountains and fields, heading toward the distance following the sound. Jingjiu knew that she was informing the elders of the tribes for help. It didn't take long before a band of black smoke suddenly appeared a few miles away. The sword lights broke through the dense forest. The leaves were cut in half and fell down in a rustling sound, looking like a flock of birds being killed. There was an open space in the forest where a simple temple was built. It was unclear which mountain god was worshipped there. The mountain god temple had already been surrounded by curtains. The knots were a little messy, and it was obvious that it was done in a hurry. Jingjiu looked through the curtains and saw at least 10 barbarians kneeling on the ground with their foreheads touching the ground. Their bodies were trembling, not out of fear, but out of excitement. There were even more barbarians rushing over from the distant mountains. Similarly, no one dared to look into the curtains. They all lowered their heads and knelt down, appearing extremely pious. There were a few elders who were dressed differently. Their clothes were more luxurious, and they had silver necklaces on their necks. They were probably wizards or elders. Nan Wang's expression did not change. It seemed that he was very used to this kind of treatment. She said something indecipherable. The southern barbarians outside the curtain kowtowed repeatedly, kissed the ground, and then retreated further away. As Jingjiu walked into the temple, he saw a godly statue with a hand supporting its chin and a half-lotus on its head, looking familiar. "Is this your ancestor?" he asked. Nan Wang said, "It's me." Jingjiu was taken aback at first, but then felt relieved. The biggest difference between the cultivation practitioners and the mortals was their lifespan, and time was a myth. The ground of the temple had already been dug up, revealing some black things. Judging from the freshness of the soil, it should have been dug up by the tribal elders after receiving the message from Nan Wang. Those black things were not coal, but the dark wood. There were many ancient trees of 1,000 years buried under the divine temple of the southern barbarians, and they were called the divine trees. These divine trees had suddenly turned into the dark wood, which meant many things. The expression on Nan Wang's face turned grave. She sat on the ground, but her breathing became even more sluggish. She put her left foot back under her buttocks and stretched out her right leg. Her bare foot was like a white lotus, and she supported her chin with her hand, looking pensive. If she held an alcohol jar in her hand, it would be the usual scene of a drunk beauty on the top of Qingrong Peak under the starry sky. She didn't have an alcohol jar. She looked like the deity statue in the temple at the moment. Jingjiu looked at her in silence. Nan Wang closed her eyes as if she were sleeping. All of a sudden, the silver bells on her body rang. These small silver bells on her body wouldn't ring randomly, no matter when she was walking or riding the sword. The silver bells vibrated faster and faster, and the crisp sounds became more frequent, passing through the curtains and resounding in the mountains and fields. The cheers of the southern barbarians could be heard outside the temple, followed by the rough and vigorous music and singing, and then the sound of footsteps on the ground. It was time to start dancing. Time passed slowly. Nan Wang was still sleeping, and the silver bells were still ringing until the night fell. The campfires were lit. The barbarians didn't feel tired, and they kept on singing and dancing. On the contrary, they became even more enthusiastic under the influence of alcohol. Jingjiu sensed at least thousands of energies converging in the mountain god temple, growing thicker and thicker, on the verge of turning into joyful raindrops. Nan Wang suddenly opened her eyes, emotionless. She pointed a finger in the air. The seemingly simple pointing finger was actually the combination of the endless sword style of Qingrong Peak and the godly magic of the southern barbarians. She was the only one in all of Chaotian who could employ it. Countless extremely fine threads of light gushed out of her fingertips and instantly formed a huge pattern. The pattern was bright and dark, gradually taking shape. One could vaguely tell that it was a map of the southern continent. The closer they were to Deer Mountain, the clearer the map was. Even a small stream or a cave could be marked on the map, but the farther they were, the blurrier the pattern became. As for the distant icy snow kingdom, it was completely blank on the map. There was a glowing spot on the map near Deer Mountain, which should be the mountain god temple where they were at the moment. A dark line extended from that glowing spot to the distance. Jingjio knew it was his turn. His line of sight fell on the blank area at the bottom of the map, where a glowing spot appeared. It was the South Ocean, where the godly boat of Punglai Island had been slaughtered. The second glowing spot had arrived at the southern shore, where all the inhabitants of the village had died mysteriously. Soon after, more and more glowing spots appeared. They were the places that the Aoyama sect considered suspicious in the last few days. The distribution of these glowing spots seemed to be random, but if one looked at them from a distance, they could vaguely see that they looked like a fan, forming a line from the deep end of the South Ocean to the small village on the shore, and then gradually spreading northward. The dark line that had left the mountain god temple had arrived at this fan-shaped area, and had gradually separated into a dozen glowing spots, lining up and down in an orderly manner. Ijo was not far from this band of glowing spots, so the West Ocean was not too far away. Jingjio fell silent. He had thought that Nan Shu would make another choice, but he didn't expect him to be so confident. Nan Wang had sat for a whole night and consumed a great deal of his mental energy, so he felt a bit tired. "Where is it?" he asked after stretching himself. Those glowing spots looked small on the map, but they were actually at least 100 square miles in circumference. As she spoke, she swayed back and forth, her silvery bell quivering slightly, and her small mouth pouting, looking like a young woman of the Barbara tribes who had been wronged. Looking at her snow-white belly, Jingjio thought it would be better if she didn't drink alcohol. Noticing his gaze, Nin Wang asked, "Do you want to?" Jingjio didn't want to die, nor did he want to touch it. "Here," he said while pointing to a glowing spot on the map. Nan Wang had forgotten what had happened earlier, asking why. Jingjio said while pointing to the village by the seashore, "According to his normal traveling speed, this is the place he is most likely to arrive at." Nan Wang thought that the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island had a profound cultivation state, and he could travel thousands of miles freely like a fairy swordsman. What was the normal traveling speed? Jingjio said, "If Nanshu leaked a sliver of his energy, it would be detected by the sword formation of Aoyama. As such, he must have found a way to shield his energy temporarily, like what Emperor Shao did. But no matter what method he used, he couldn't move. Otherwise, his energy would leak out. Nobody in Chaotian could move at the same time while moving at the same time. Even though Jingjio had learned the underworld fairy sword, he could only achieve the same result. Now that Nanchu couldn't move, he had no choice but to ask someone else to do it. In order not to attract the attention of the cultivation circle, he had to use the most common method to transport Nanchu. Who was the person who sent Nanchu to the deep part of Chaotian? It was certainly not the Western Sea Sword School, because the Aoyama sect had been keeping an eye on that place. Jingjio didn't know who that person was, but he knew another fact. "He's in the coffin," he said. Thinking of the dark energy he sensed when he employed the magic, Nan Wang's expression changed slightly. A horse-drawn carriage carrying a coffin had been heading north on the official road for the last few days. The coffin was old, and it was obvious that it had been nurtured well. The young woman driving the carriage was also nurtured well. The young woman was small in stature and had a pretty face. She looked even more beautiful in the white mourning dress, which attracted the interest of many evildoers. Yet, those evildoers had no idea that the young woman had been a true evildoer in Bulolin. Nanjung did not dare to kill at will, but it was easy for her to get rid of these people. More than 10 days later, she drove the carriage to a vast and wild mountain. The mountain road had already come to an end, and the outline of a city could be vaguely seen in the distance outside the cliff, but it was something that happened hundreds of miles away. Not even a trace of spiritual aura could be sensed in the mountains here. It was truly barren. She guessed that it should be the wild mountains around Ijo. This wild mountain was sparsely populated, and there were no cultivation sections. Only the Baotong Zen temple, which was built by the Zen sect to clean up the poisonous miasma, remained here. Nanjung did not expect to see a temple in this wilderness. It was the mountain god temple in the tribe that she was once very familiar with but had not seen for many years. This place was at least thousands of miles away from Deer Mountain. Why was there a tribe temple here? The mountain deity temple was very old and small. After carrying the coffin in, there was only a very narrow space left, barely able to lie down. When she turned to look at the black coffin, the strange feeling in her heart became even stronger. There was no aura in the black coffin, as if the old ancestor inside was really dead. She did not know why the old ancestor came here, nor did she know how long she had to wait here, but she did not dare to leave. Night fell, and the wild mountains were as dark as ink. There was no sound at all, not even the howling of wild animals. Nanjung was a kung fu practitioner in Bulo Lin, so she was not afraid of wild animals, but she was afraid of this kind of silence. She found some oil under the stone statue in the mountain god temple and poured it into the lantern outside the temple. The lantern was broken, but it could still be lit, and it was red. The warm red light illuminated the ruined temple. It looked a little festive and a little scary. Uploaded by the phone. She did not know what happened. She had written a lot of words of thanks. Chapter 496. The sudden sprinkling of red light startled Nanjung. What happened next terrified her even more. A faint energy came out from the bottom of the godly statue, shrouding the entire ruined temple. The silver bells on her body were ringing crisply even though there was no wind. Who was employing the tribal magic? How could it be so powerful? Nanjung was more afraid that the ringing of the bells might alert the great grandmaster in the black coffin. What if the great grandmaster vented his anger on her? Squeaking, the lid of the black coffin was moved open slowly, revealing a small crack. Nanjung spun her head around and almost fainted. It was unclear when a person had appeared in front of the black coffin. It was a small child, wearing a button-down shirt with his hair combed into a bun. He was thin and small, his face pale. The child reached his hand into the air and picked up the faint energy. He brought it to his nose and smelled it, saying in an old voice, "It's the smell of a fake god." Soon, the faint aura disappeared. The child didn't do anything. He sat on the coffin, looking in the direction of Aoyama in the distance. Nanjing's face was even paler than his, wondering what this thing was and what the hell it was. The child seemed to know what was on her mind, saying, "You're right. I'm the Sword Ghost. You can call me the child of the Sword Ghost." Nanjung, of course, knew what the Sword Ghost was, but it was impossible for such a Sword Ghost to exist in this world. Neither the Sword Ghost nor the Yuanying had their own intelligence or soul before their true bodies disappeared. But it was evident that the child sitting on the coffin was different. "Guard me well. Don't let those wild animals wake me up." Having said this, the child of the Sword Ghost drifted up, disappearing into the dark mountains. It wasn't until a long while later that Nanjung calmed down a bit. She came to the front of the black coffin with stiff steps and peered nervously into the crack. Nanshu's skinny body was still in the coffin, devoid of any energy, as if he had died a long time ago. There was a gentle slope in front of the Shui nunnery, at the foot of which stood a huge peach tree, the petals falling down like raindrops in the wind. Two young girls were talking under the peach tree. "My mastery of the heaven and man connection is too poor. The abbess has just divined for some a few days ago. She will need another half a year before she can do it again. It has been a long time since the Grand Supreme Elder received any visitors." Zheng Tao felt quite apologetic after refusing 3 times in a row. She said with a slightly red face, "Big Sister Wudong has a strange temperament. She is recuperating from her wound, so I don't dare send a message. Back in Xiaoga City, Mo Shi of Shuai nunnery colluded with Bulo Lin in an attempt to assassinate Zhao Liu. After the assassination failed, her limbs were chopped off by Guodong and thrown in front of the Zhao Manor house. Mo, she was still alive. She was raised in a village on the other side of the mountain. People from the nunnery would visit her occasionally. Jin Tao had heard her big sisters describe her terrible condition, so she was quite afraid of big sister Guodong. "I'm fine," Bai Zhao said with a smile. She had already guessed who Guodong was, so she wouldn't force Zhang Tao. The reason she came to the Shuai nunnery this time was because of the request from the senior master Guodong. Back then, Pei Baifa fell into the ocean and died, and Su Zai betrayed Yijan. But the scheme of the West Ocean wasn't over yet. Through big brother Tong Yin, Zhao Liu learned of the senior master Guodong's hope for her. So she wanted to come to the Shuai nunnery to see her and ask the senior masters of the nunnery to predict the future of this trip. It was fine if she couldn't predict the future. It was better for her to try her best. She hoped that her big brother was doing well. Bai Zhao bid farewell to Zheng Tao and turned to head down the mountain. When she arrived at the foot of the mountain, she found a few flower petals falling on her shoulder. She suddenly recalled that there was a begonia tree in the courtyard of the Jing house in Zhaoga City, and Jingjiu looked at her in the rain of flower petals in the study room, seemingly appreciating her. After this matter was settled, the threat to Aoyama would be eliminated and the cultivation circle would be peaceful. Jingjiu, who was so lazy, should be happy about it. A white line appeared on the blue West Ocean. Tong Yin was walking on the surface of the ocean. Jingjiu didn't forget his promise to him. He brought the green sky mirror to the 3,000 nunnery outside the Yuan city, and then asked the old nun to let him out. The green sky mirror wasn't tied to Tong Yan's back. Was it placed in a special spatial magic treasure? If so, why didn't he use it when he was at the Guoqing Temple and on the Coal Mountain? Dozens of white lines appeared in the sky. The disciples of the Western Sea Sword School arrived by riding their swords and brought him to the fallen immortal island. He could see the endless blue ocean and the thousand-year waves through the huge window by the cliff's edge. The godly swordsman of West Ocean turned to Tong Yin and asked expressionlessly, "What did you use to throw yourself to me?" "The green sky mirror," replied Tong Yin. This was an answer that anyone could think of. Without a magic treasure of the heavenly state, who would be willing to pay the price of being suspected by the Zhongzhou school? "What do you want?" asked the godly swordsman of West Ocean. "Stay alive," replied Tong Yin. The godly swordsman of West Ocean said, "If you didn't steal the green sky mirror, you could still stay alive at the Zhongzhou school and live a good life there. So this reason is not valid. Those who weren't good at scheming didn't mean that they weren't smart. It was just that people like him and Jingyang didn't want to be distracted by their cultivation. If Tong Yin couldn't give him a suitable reason, the godly swordsman of West Ocean wouldn't mind killing him and sending his head to the Cloud Dream Mountain. "So I won't give the green sky mirror to you." Tong Yin continued, "I heard that a copy of the mysterious supreme magic is at the West Ocean. I'll ask the mirror spirit to come out and meet you after I've mastered it." How could he stay alive? He couldn't count on other sects to take him in. All he could do was improve his cultivation state as quickly as possible. Though Tong Yan's request was quite reasonable, the compensation he offered sounded a bit too little. Yet, the godly swordsman of West Ocean displayed an appreciative expression, saying, "You're much better than Lo Huainan." In his cultivation state, it was meaningless to comprehend the Tao in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. The most valuable thing was the mirror spirit. If the spirit of the green sky mirror was the true spirit of the heavenly state, she would be the only one in Chaotian for tens of thousands of years. This kind of new life form could bring many inspirations and opportunities to the godly swordsman of West Ocean, who had already reached the top of his cultivation state. Tong Yin was locked in the stone room on Xiaoming Island. Besides the clean water, there was only a copy of the mysterious supreme magic in the stone room. He would be able to leave when he learned the mysterious supreme magic. Strangely enough, Tong Yin didn't open the copy right away. Instead, he stared blankly at the stone wall, as if he had heard something. It was the same as when he heard Qing calling for help while staring at the stone wall in the manor cave left by Lo Huainan a few years ago. Ching flew out from his sleeve and flew around the narrow stone room a few times. "It's safe here," she commented contentedly. Tong Yin was still staring at the stone wall. Ching flew back to Jing Jiu's shoulder and sat on his shoulder. "But the godly swordsman of West Ocean is so powerful, and he looks so greedy. What if he wants to rob me when we meet?" she asked worriedly. Tong Yin kept staring at the stone wall without saying a word. An invisible map appeared in front of his eyes. This map was not a real one, but a memory in his mind. As the second best chess player in the world, Jing Jiu also had an unimaginable memory. The map was drawn by Su Zai. The densely packed words on the map were all kinds of formations and mechanisms. The red line on the map led to a hidden manor cave on Xiaoming Island. Tong Yin suddenly took off his clothes and walked to the front of the stone wall, starting to dig a hole. Ching covered her face with her small hands hastily. "Are you going to escape?" she asked Jing Jiu through the gaps between her fingers. The great formation of the mountain gate of the Western Sea Sword School was far away, and the defensive formation of Xiaoming Island was outside. As long as he didn't dig outside, he wouldn't have to worry about triggering the formation. But if he didn't dig outside, he wouldn't be able to escape even if he dug for the rest of his life. "I'm going to a place," said Tong Yin. After a few years, Tong Yin started to dig a hole again. But it would take him much less time to dig a hole this time. It was because he was quite familiar with this kind of work, and the place he was going to was on Xiaoming Island, not far from here. There was no light in the tunnel he dug, so he couldn't tell whether it was day or night. Tong Yin crawled out from the underground. Ching moved faster than Jing Jiu. She circled around the manor cave a few times and made sure there were no traps or magic treasures to spy on her. "It's safe, but there's a strange thing," she said. Tong Yin walked to the deep end of the manor cave and looked at the sword. The sword was long and thin, with a cold and faint energy. It was obvious that it was not an ordinary sword. It was the first child sword. Looking at the sword, Ching exclaimed in surprise, "This sword is really good." It could be said that this was the best sword she had ever seen, only slightly inferior to Jing Jiu's. Yet, she didn't like Jing Jiu, the bad guy. Tong Yin remained silent while looking at the first child sword. 800 years ago, Nanchu returned to Chaotian. It was this first child sword that killed many swordsmen and sneak attacked the immortal Daoyuan of the Aoyama sect. The immortal Daoyuan destroyed Nanchu's Dao tree and took the first child sword from him. Later, ended up in the royal palace for some reason. The emperor gave the first child sword to Zhao Liu through Jin Mingxing. In Guiyun City, Zhao Liu and Lu Shisui joined hands to kill Lo Huainan, and they used this sword. Later, this sword was taken by Lu Shisui, and then taken away by Shiwang Sunday unexpectedly. The emperor had left a mark on this sword. Pei Baifa came out from behind closed doors in the rainstorm and wounded Shiwang's son severely with the first child sword. The first child sword fell into the mortal world and was taken away by Guodong. She gave it to Tong Lu in the vegetable garden of the Baotong Zen temple. In the end, Tong Lu died, and the first child sword returned to the West Ocean. This sword had too many legendary stories. Strangely enough, Tong Yin happened to know all the stories about the first child sword in recent years, and some of them were even related to him. What kind of new story was he going to write with this first child sword? However, the first child sword had the mark left by the emperor and the forbidding formation set up by the godly swordsman. He couldn't erase either of them, so he couldn't take them away. Why did he come here then? Did he just want to take a look? Ching shot him a glance. Tong Yin didn't say anything. He walked to a corner and sat down waiting. He didn't know how long he would have to wait. Maybe 10 days or many years. But it didn't matter. It would be like that year. There was a bigger manor cave a few miles away from the manor cave, where Tong Yin was hiding. These two manor caves were the most important places on Xiaoming Island. Insan and the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect walked into the manor cave. Looking at the books around, they were certain that the center of the formation was hidden in the manor cave. Next, they had to find a first child sword. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect walked to the front of the stone wall and was about to dig a hole. Looking at his withering right hand, Insan said calmly, "No need." The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect said contentedly, "Immortal, you don't have to worry about triggering the formation. I'm good at digging holes." It was true that the person who was good at digging holes was never Tongyan. In terms of speed, he was not as good as Jingjiu. In terms of accuracy and familiarity, how could he compare to the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect, who had been forced into hiding by the sword formation of Aoyama and had been digging holes for more than 300 years? Insan pulled back his right hand and said with a faint smile, "No need to dig. When the center of the formation is broken, we'll walk over and take it away." From the perspective of scheming, he was the best at digging holes in this world. Something went wrong with the Chapter 1 updated yesterday, so I posted it on my cell phone at the last minute. As a result, my acceptance speech was lost. I'm so angry. I'm happy today, so I took my niece to go skiing. Of course, I'm riding in the hotel. On this happy occasion, I like to sing a song. Hey, 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 yeah, I'm the best at digging holes. Chapter 497. Hello, Dog Huang. I still use this chapter title. I intended to call this chapter, "Let's Hear the Meowing Together." The firecrackers outside the window remind me that the new year is coming. It's time for a holiday. It's so comfortable. I'm looking forward to it. 330 years ago, the human cultivation practitioners and the high-level creatures of the Snowy Kingdom had a war in the Lonling Snowland. Since then, the cultivation circle hadn't had a real war. The fights between the cultivation sects and the fights between the orthodox and deviant sects were merely battles. The scale and intensity of the battle of the cloud platform were far from enough. Yet, a real war between the Aoyama sect and the Western Sea Sword School was inevitable. Since it was a war, it was necessary to make thorough preparations and analyze the situation before the war. If the Western Sea Sword School was led by the godly swordsman, Nanshu was the real killer. In fact, the Aoyama sect had been studying this first hidden swordsman for many years. On the basis of hundreds of years of study, they attempted to determine the method by which Nanshu could seal his energy and evade the great formation of Aoyama. The giant friend of Jingjiu had encountered the fog on the foggy island in the South Ocean and was certain that the fog was a natural phenomenon on the island, which would gradually dissipate when it was too far away from the island. Hence, Nanshu must not have used this method. After a complicated and meticulous calculation of Nanshu's background, his previous cultivation methods, and his temperament and intelligence, and 2 elders of Shuriwa Peak had passed out, the Aoyama sect had finally arrived at a conclusion that was more than 90% reliable. Nanshu had used the mountain god soul-capturing method of the barbaric tribes to refine himself into a living corpse. The living corpse didn't have any vitality, so it could evade the search of the great formation of Aoyama. When needed, Nanshu would wake up and strike a deadly sword at Lu Ci or Yuan Shijing at the critical moment before the great formation of Aoyama was activated. Nan Wang came from the southern barbaric tribes, so she was familiar with these magic methods. As such, Lu Ci suggested that Jingjiu take her with him. Feeling displeased, Zhao Liu yelled in a low voice, "Now that you know he is in the coffin, why don't you follow this clue to investigate?" Jingjiu said, "There are too many coffins. It's impossible to find out." Nan Wang was stunned. He didn't understand why there were so many coffin carts. Did many people die every day? Jingjiu looked at her expression and sighed in his heart. He and Lu Ci were the same in the beginning. They did not understand why so many people died every day. It wasn't until the curtain rollers sent them the data that they found out that more than 10 million people died in Chaotian every year on average, and more than 3 million people died in the area they were investigating. This meant that 10,000 coffins would be opened and closed in the places they were investigating every day. Actually, this was common sense. It was just that the lifespan of cultivators was too long, so they couldn't think of this point. Nan Wang and Jingjiu left Deer Mountain and headed west. They came to the mountains hundreds of miles away from Izhou. It was already summer, but the mountain was not cool at all. Instead, it was even more stuffy and hot. In addition, there were no spiritual veins, so it was no wonder that there were so few people. The highly achieved monks of the Baotong Zen temple took out the precious red moss that had been preserved since spring to entertain the two distinguished guests, but they didn't find any clues. Before they left the Zen temple, Jingjiu made a detour to the vegetable garden to have a look, but he didn't find anything either. The white cat suddenly meowed toward the sky in the northeast while squatting on Jingjiu's shoulder. Nan Wang leapt up on his sword without hesitation and flew in the direction of the sky. Jingjiu followed him, but he had a bad premonition. The reason he took the white cat with him was not for safety, but for smelling. In the entire Aoyama, the cat was the only one with a good sense of smell, save for the dead dog. It was a desolate mountain full of miasma and wild trees, devoid of roads and traces of human beings. The white cat squatted on Jingjiu's shoulder and raised his head to sniff the air, meowing once in a while. Jingjiu and Nan Wang kept changing their direction while listening to the meowing of the cat, and they went deeper into the mountain. As dusk approached, the white cat yawned and shook his head a few times, trying to keep himself awake. Then he meowed once, reminding them that they were still ahead of them. Nan Wang thought the cat's current dignified appearance was much more adorable than its previous ferocious appearance, so she reached out her hand in an attempt to rub his head. The white cat wouldn't let her touch him. He opened his small mouth and bared his teeth, which were sharper than the flying swords, and was about to bite her with a low growl. It was then that his expression changed abruptly, and he climbed down from Jingjiu's shoulder at a high speed and entered his sleeve, unwilling to come out again. Seeing Jingjiu's quivering sleeve, Nan Wang remained silent. Looking at the mountain and fields ahead, Jingjiu had a grave expression on his face. He had found it. There was an old path buried by weeds in the deep end of the mountain and fields. There was a dilapidated small temple at the end of the path, with a lantern hanging in front of it. There was a black coffin in the ruined temple. A young woman walked out from the temple, wearing a short skirt and adorned with silver bells, but she didn't make any sound as she walked. The young woman lit the lantern outside the temple, and the red light illuminated the ruined temple. It was nightfall. On a cliff a few miles away, Jingjiu pulled back his gaze and looked at Nan Wang. That young woman resembled Nan Wang. To eliminate the influence of the descendants of Nan Shu, I order my tribe to kill many people, but some of them managed to escape. Looking at the young woman walking back into the temple, Nan Wang said expressionlessly, "Her name should be Nanzheng." After saying this, she took out a wine pot from somewhere and started to drink. She didn't drink because she felt sentimental when she saw Nanzheng, but because she was scared. Nanchu should be lying in that black coffin. She was the peak master of Qingrong of the Aoyama sect and a swordsman in the upper state of the Broken Sea, but she was nothing in her opponent's eyes. Jingjiu said while looking at her, "You should drink less alcohol and practice your sword work more." Nan Wang had a good talent for cultivation. If she were willing to spend more time drinking, singing, and feeling sentimental and sad, she would have reached the upper limit of the Broken Sea state a long time ago. Back then, Jingjiu and Lu Xi thought that Nan Wang was the most likely candidate to enter the heavenly arrival state after Fang Jingtian, but she had already been surpassed by Guang Yuanjinren. It was a pity in Jingjiu's eyes. Nan Wang wondered if this guy was scared senseless by the black coffin and dared speak to him in such a tone. Jingjiu was also surprised that she didn't ask him whether he wanted to die or not. He guessed that she was very nervous at the moment. Pointing to the ruined temple in the distance, he asked, "Who is the godly statue in the temple?" This ruined temple was obviously built in the style of the godly temples of the southern barbaric tribes, but the godly statue in the temple didn't look like Nan Wang. It was much taller, and the paint on the statue's face had fallen off a long time ago, but still gave off a cold and murderous aura. "It should be Nan Chu himself," said Nan Wang. Nan Chu was the true god of the southern barbaric tribes 800 years ago, so his cultivation state and status were worthy of the title. However, as he was forced into the foggy island by the sword formation of Aoyama, he had been forgotten by most of the inhabitants of the tribes. This dilapidated temple was very likely to be his last temple. Thinking of this possibility, Nan Wang raised the alcohol jar again and gulped down a mouthful of alcohol. Jing Jiao sensed the trembling in his sleeve and knew that Ada was still scared. He stroked Ada through the cloth to comfort him, and then said to Nan Wang, "Don't be scared. I'm here. You're not your master. Don't talk nonsense." Nan Wang wiped the alcohol off the corners of his mouth and said expressionlessly, "Guard this place well. I'll go inform the sect master." Jing Jiao sat down cross-legged after saying, "I'll do it." The white cat was startled by something and crawled out from Jing Jiao's sleeve. He climbed onto Jing Jiao's shoulder and held Jing Jiao's neck tightly with his paws. His sleeve ruffled without the aid of the wind, and a sword bracelet fell off from Jing Jiao's wrist. The bracelet dissolved into the wind and turned back into the original thoughtless sword, turning into a blood-red line and vanishing into the twilight. Looking at the disappearing blood-red line, Nan Wang felt it odd. She and the elders of the peaks witnessed Jing Jiao's born shapeless sword body with their own eyes at the sword trial that year, and they were certain that he was a rare genius in the sword work. But how old was this guy? And he had only practiced the sword for a few years. How could he be able to travel with the sword? And wasn't the thoughtless sword the one Jingyang left for Zhao Lei? Why could he use it? The night shrouded the wild mountain and the ruined temple, making the red lantern even more eye-catching. The black coffin lay in the temple in silence, giving off an eerie and dreadful feeling. On the cliff a few miles away, Nan Wang and the white cat stared at the ruined temple without moving their gazes away. One of them was standing and the other was lying on the ground, blending into the surrounding trees and weeds. It took a long time for the night to pass. The morning glow illuminated the sky. Jing Jiao opened his eyes. The traveling sword was over, but the thoughtless sword hadn't come back yet. Nan Wang was fully aware of how fast the thoughtless sword could travel, but he couldn't figure it out. Knowing that Nan Shu was here, the Aoyama sect should have attacked with all their strength. But why hadn't they sent back any news? Jing Jiao got up and looked at the ruined temple amid the morning sunlight, saying, "I told them that Nan Shu was here, but I didn't ask them to come over." It was true that Nan Shu had employed the mountain god soul capturing method to turn himself into a corpse in the coffin, but it was more than that. The corpse in the black coffin was devoid of any energy, as if it were a real corpse. Yet, Jing Jiao felt that something was missing from the corpse. The eerie red lantern reminded him of a possibility. The red lantern was used to summon the soul. Had Nan Shu's soul left? The soul of the orthodox cultivation practitioners was the Yuanying, and the soul of the cultivation practitioners was the sword spirit. The people in Chaotian were more accustomed to calling it the sword ghost. This habit originated from Nan Shu's ghostly sword style. The corpse in the black coffin had lost its soul, which meant that Nan Shu's sword ghost was gone. If it were any other cultivation practitioner, they would think that the absence of the sword ghost meant that the corpse was truly dead, even if that person was Nan Shu. Yet, Jing Jiao knew that the sword ghost could live alone under certain special circumstances. He believed that an old guy like Nan Shu would shock heaven and earth if he were truly dead. It was impossible for him to die so quietly. Nan Shu's sword ghost must be alive, but it was unclear where he had gone. Jing Jiao didn't ask Lu Xi and Yuan Qijin to come here, because he was worried that Nan Shu's sword ghost might have gone to the West Ocean. If that were the case, Aoyama would have to send all its forces to the West Ocean in order to avoid any mishaps. Nan Wang didn't understand why the Big Brother Sect Master and the Big Brother Sword Justice listened to Jing Jiao's opinion. What if Nan Shu woke up in the coffin? She remained silent while looking at the ruined temple, her face pale. The Master White Ghost was the principal guard of Aoyama and a figure in the initial state of the heavenly arrival. But they were still no match for Nan Shu's sword, even if they joined hands. It was then that the young woman walked out of the ruined temple and blew out the red lantern. According to my calculation, the corpse in the coffin won't wake up, so we are safe. Jing Jiao went on. All we need to do is destroy the lantern and the corpse in the coffin when necessary. The white cat meowed pitifully as he thought to himself that he didn't dare do such a thing. Nan Wang sneered, "You can do it if you want." Thinking of the ominous premonition, Jing Jiao said, "You're right. You guys go first. I'll wait here." End of this chapter. Chapter 498. If Nan Shu in the coffin didn't wake up as Jing Jiao had predicted, he would be a corpse. However, if he woke up, he would be a ferryman who was invincible under the sword. It seemed to be a simple choice. Nan Wang turned around and headed toward the deep part of the mountain. The white cat traveled even faster than her, turning into a white shadow and disappearing instantly without making a sound. Jing Jiao didn't pay much attention to it. It was a suggestion to begin with, and he wasn't confident that the corpse in the coffin wouldn't wake up. The morning sun rose higher and higher, and the sky grew bluer and bluer, and the scenery of the mountain grew clearer. The barren mountain was not far from the ocean, but it didn't have much rain here, and the living beings here were few and far between, even inferior to the cold mountain. Though the cold mountain looked barren, it was in fact rich in fire sources and underground rivers, where many wild animals and demons lived. However, the autumn scenery here was more beautiful and more intense, probably because it was too plain. The golden leaves and the red leaves were arranged neatly according to the height, looking like ribbons drawn by a paintbrush. Jing Jiao pulled back his line of sight and looked at his right hand. Back when he was at the West Ocean, Jian Shilai cut his body in half from a distance of 10 miles, and Ada was wounded by a casual swing of his sword. He was in the best state in recent years, and he was indeed worthy of the title of godly swordsman. Unlike the years before when he was outshone by Chao Yuan, Manchu was his master, and his cultivation state was unfathomable. Yet, none of this was a problem. Lu Xi was the immortal sect master of the Aoyama sect. He was the strongest swordsman in Aoyama. He must be the strongest swordsman in Chaotian. Neither Jian Shilai nor Nanshu was a match for Lu Xi. However, Lu Xi didn't have a sword. Back when the immortal Jingyang ascended, he forced Jian Shilai back to the West Ocean, but didn't kill him. During the Battle of the Cloud Platform, he and Jian Shilai exchanged blows and were evenly matched in the sky above the ocean. It was because he didn't have a sword. If Nanshu used the sword ghost to fight him, would Lu Xi be able to defeat him without a sword? Of course, Jing Jiao was the most suitable candidate. He knew that Lu Xi also hoped so, but he did not want to accept it. The bad premonition seemed to be constantly warning him that if he accepted Lu Xi's request, there would definitely be problems, and he would regret it. The weeds moved despite the absence of wind. Nan Wang walked back with the white cat by its neck and asked, "According to your calculations, what are the chances of him waking up?" Jing Jiao reached out and took the white cat. He calculated again and said, "No more than 10%. The white cat meowed softly, looking very aggrieved. Of course, Jing Jiao knew that Nan Wang couldn't catch it. It came back because it wanted to come back, or it was too embarrassed to leave. The incident at the Guoqing Temple had brought it a lot of trouble. For example, Zhao Liu no longer hugged it, and the change in attitude between Gu Qing and Yuan Shu was a deep lesson. As for Nan Wang came back, Jing Jiao found that her temples were a bit wet, so he guessed that she had taken a bath in the stream. Nan Wang liked to sing folk songs when she had a good time drinking. When it was inconvenient for her to sing folk songs, she liked to play in the water. Whenever she saw a stream or a lake, she would take off her clothes and jump into it. She had liked to do this many years ago. Lu Xi had no choice but to designate the lake on the top of Bihu Peak as a forbidden area for her, which wasn't removed until she took over the position of the peak master of Qingrong. 90%, that's indeed a high number. Nan Wang was indeed drunk. She picked up the alcohol jar and gulped down a mouthful of it, saying, "I should be fine. I'll be fine as long as you're here," said Jing Jiao. Nan Wang turned her head and stared at Jing Jiao with her big and bright eyes, saying nothing. This was the third thing that Jing Jiao was most afraid of. Jing Jiao turned his head to look at the ruined temple a few miles away while avoiding her gaze. "Who the hell are you?" asked Nan Wang. Jingjio knew that she couldn't figure out his true identity, just like what Dong couldn't figure it out in the beginning. It was the same principle. Jingjio didn't answer her question, but said, "I still suggest that you two leave." "Do you still remember the horse-drawn carriage in Daozhou City?" asked Nan Wang. In the middle of summer, when they were searching for the clues of Nan Chu's hiding place, that horse-drawn carriage rushed to the lakeside, bringing them the latest news. The doctor didn't conceal his identity because the lake was a forbidden area of the Eastern Mountain sect, and nobody could get close to it. The Eastern Mountain sect was a local sect supported by the Chung clan, and the Chung clan was an inconspicuous external sect on Shuriwa Peak. There were many similar situations, especially in the south. There were at least dozens of merchant houses like the Precious Tree House, and 6 or 7 large clans like the Gu clan. The southern barbaric tribes had to rely on Nan Wang's support to live a relatively peaceful life in this patch of hot and stuffy mountain. The imperial court had never thought of imposing taxes and corvée labor. She was a drunkard in Jingjio's eyes, but she was a true immortal in the southern barbaric tribes. If Aoyama collapsed, all of this would cease to exist, and these mortals might die. This was the reason. As such, Nan Wang couldn't leave. The white cat couldn't leave, and neither could Jingjio. The sword lights illuminated the sky of Aoyama, bringing along the ominous blood-red color and the signal of a battle. The blood-red line fell from Tianguang Peak to Shinma Peak and changed back to the shape of the thoughtless sword in Zhao Liu's hand. She inserted the thoughtless sword into the ground and turned it around forcefully, activating the forbidding formation of Shinma Peak, and then walked toward the outside of the cliff. A small sword boat was anchored on the ocean of clouds outside the cliff, and a few disciples of Shuriwa Peak were bowing to welcome it. Yuan Chu had already made the necessary preparations. He led Ping Yongka on the boat. The farewell voices of the monkeys could be heard at the bottom of the cliff. This sword boat was indeed small and could only accommodate a few dozen people, but it was extremely luxurious. Looking at the small sword formation at the bow of the boat, Ping Yongka exclaimed in surprise, "How many crystals would it cost to make a round trip to and from the West Ocean? What does it have to do with us?" Yuan Chu retorted. Ping Yongka still thought it was too wasteful, saying, "It's fine for a disciple with a poor cultivation state like me to take the sword boat, but why don't the masters ride the swords? It will be faster." Yuan Chu thought that Ping Yongka was the disciple chosen by Senior Master Jing himself. How could he be such an idiot? "Let me ask you, which is more comfortable, riding the swords or riding the sword boat?" "The latter, of course," Ping Yongka said matter-of-factly. Yuan Chu snapped, "Are you going to let the masters ride the swords while you sleep in the boat?" The elders and disciples of the other peaks were also boarding the sword boats, but the number of people on those peaks was much greater than on Shinma Peak, so the sword boats were much larger. The cold fog on the Shangda Peak dispersed in all directions, and the sword boats were intermittently visible in the fog. Yuan Qijing was the first to board the boat. Qi Yin, Duan Liantian, and other elders were arranging the positions of the disciples. Young sister Yushan was well protected, and her position was the closest to the sword justice, surrounded by big brothers. It was believed that she would be safe even if the sword boat was destroyed. The lake water on the top of Bihu Peak was turbulent, generating countless snowy waves. Chun Yutian boarded the boat with dozens of sword practitioners, and it was not until today that he realized the lake water tasted a bit salty. The disciples of Liangwang Peak were also boarding the boat, their sword lights flashing and their robes fluttering. Guinan Shan and the others had to step onto the battlefield less than 100 days after they came back from the snowland. The disciples of Shuriwa Peak were also boarding the boat under the leadership of Guang Yuanjinren. A crisp cry broke out on the stone beam, enshrouded in the fog, all year round. A dark shadow broke through the fog, but it didn't land on the sword boat on Shuriwa Peak, but on the sword boat on the Shangda Peak. Chapter 499. Jing Jiao and Nan Wang were staring at the physical body of the great grandmaster of the foggy island, Nan Shu, on a barren mountain. The Aoi Sect drove a dozen sword boats to suppress the West Ocean. Yin San and the young mysterious Dark Master were looking for a sword on Xiaoming Island at the West Ocean, and Tong Yin had already found it. The Battle of the West Ocean was on its way, and the reactions from all sides were making people anxious. I wish everybody a happy holiday. As dozens of sword letters were sent to various places in Chaotian, the news had spread quickly. Taiping Jinren had come out from behind closed doors and was at the West Ocean. The Aoi Sect went there to ask for him. Unlike the case of the Snow Girl, the Aoi Sect didn't conceal anything this time, and they didn't choose who to inform. It was as if they had announced it to the whole world. Hearing the news, the people in the world had different reactions. It took some people a long time to remember that this Taiping Jinren was the former sect master of the Aoi Sect, who stayed behind closed doors in order to seek the path of ascension. At the time, the Aoi Sect had issued a 400-mile prohibition, which shocked the whole of Chaotian. However, this event had happened more than 300 years ago, and the name of Taiping Jinren had been gradually forgotten. Was he still alive? If this immortal was still alive, why was he at the West Ocean? Why did the Aoi Sect attack the West Ocean because of this matter? Only those who knew the inside story knew that the sword letters of the Aoi Sect were not meant to show off, nor to demonstrate their power, but to warn others. After receiving the news, Zhang Yi went to the royal palace that very night, his face looking terrible and livid. After the turmoil of the fiend prison, he had drifted away from his master's Zhongzhou school and had been under tremendous pressure. But he had never felt so pressured that he couldn't breathe. Since Shi Fengqian had found the name of Taiping Jinren in the secret files of the Pure Heaven Bureau, as the chief commander of the Pure Heaven Bureau, he knew better than anyone else how much blood this scourge had caused in Chaotian 300 years ago. Arriving at the deep end of the palace, Jing Jiao knelt down behind the emperor and told him the contents of the sword letter of Aoyama and the plan made by the Pure Heaven Bureau that very night. To his surprise, he found that both the emperor and Serene were quite calm. Did they already know that Taiping Jinren was still alive? The earliest place to receive the Aoyama sword letters was the Guoqing Temple. Not long after Zen Master returned from the snowy plains, he squatted by the window and stared at the pile of wooden sticks in a daze. The sound of the bell came from the depths of the temple, bringing with it a sea breeze, but it could not disperse the irritation of midsummer. He straightened up and looked back at the elders of the Guoqing Temple. There was no childishness on his face. Instead, he looked serious and serious. The death of Monk Duhai, the principal disciple of the Justice Hall, had revealed many secrets. Neither the chief monk nor Jing Jiao had expressed any opinion on this matter. It was a sign of their respect for the Aoi Sect, hoping that Aoi Sect could deal with it themselves. Now that the Aoi Sect had sent a letter to Chaotian, stating that Taiping Jinren was still alive, the Guoqing Temple had to give a clear response. Ask the big brothers of the instruction hall to go to the West Ocean and keep an eye on Aoyama. Zen Master said slowly and resolutely, Taiping has to die. A few elders left after receiving the order. Zen Master waved his sleeve lightly, messing up the pile of wooden sticks. He walked out of the meditation room barefoot and arrived in front of the stone pagoda. The tranquil garden had been repaired, but the stone pagoda was still here temporarily. Looking at the stone pagoda, Zen Master remained silent. The sound of the bell had gradually died down, and so had the sea breeze. Though it was the middle of summer, the meditation room suddenly became extremely cold. The Aoi Sect attacked the West Ocean. Their allies, such as Ozawa and the Platana sect, remained silent, and Shuei Nunnery didn't say anything either. Yet, the reactions of other sects were quite intense. It was not because they felt indignant for the West Ocean, but because they were worried about the chaos that would ensue. The voice of the Broadsword King didn't ring out in the small temple in White Town, but Jui City was under martial law not long after the churchmaster of the Windy Broadsword left. Many sects in the north called back their traveling disciples, activated the great formations, and closed their mountain gates. The imperial court ordered the godly cavalry to move southward. The atmosphere in Zhaoga City was tense. Yamatsai's reaction was the most direct. Bu Qiuxiao left the 1,000-mile windy corridor with dozens of scholars and headed toward the West Ocean on the boat of diligent study with the help of dozens of scholars. Chao Tian was in turmoil. Strangely enough, the Zhongzhou school, the leader of the Orthodox sects, didn't show any reaction. They behaved too calmly. It was because Bai Jinren had known that Taiping Jinren had escaped from the sword jail a long time ago. She had her suspicions when a unicorn came back wounded in the Guocheng Temple. Later, she got confirmation from Su Zai. It was the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect who told Su Zai about it through the fat monk in the Guocheng Temple. The clouds and fog were everywhere in the valley, but they were much softer and more dreamy than the fog on the Sword Peak in Aoyama. That was why it was called Cloud Dream Mountain. The gentle wind changed the shape of the clouds and pulled up the soft white satin. Bai Jinren landed by the cliff's edge. Glancing at the white satin hanging on her elbow, Bai Jinren didn't say anything. She was fully aware that her daughter must have had a fortunate encounter after being trapped in the snowland for 6 years. This white satin made of natural worm silk was the proof, and it was also the proof of Jing Jiu's true identity. But there was no proof for it, so it was meaningless to tell her daughter about it. Besides, if her daughter could maintain this kind of relationship with Jing Jiu, it would be beneficial for her, so there was no need to make it clear. I only know that Taiping Jinren used to wreak havoc in the human world, but I didn't expect that he would cause such a commotion. Thinking of a news sent back by the people of Chaotian, Bai Zhao remarked sentimentally, "Why is it so serious? You people are still young. You don't know how many people have died because of him, and how many people will die if he is allowed to live." Thinking of the disasters on Chaotian, Bai Jinren remarked sentimentally, "Does the Aoyama sect think that they can avoid the responsibility by doing this?" Bai Zhao said, "As long as Taiping Jinren is dead, nobody needs to bear the responsibility." Bai Jinren shot a deep glance at her and said, "Get ready to go." The Aoyama sect didn't intend to hide their tracks when they launched a crusade against the Western Sea Sword School. Of course, they couldn't. 17 sword boats were flying steadily in the sky, casting a large shadow over the mountains and fields. It was comfortable to sit in the sword boats without having to fight against the chaotic wind. However, the swordsmen of the Aoyama sect were always restless, so they couldn't help but ride their swords out to get some fresh air. As a result, many sword lights could be seen around the sword boats. The straight sword lights accompanied the sword boats, creating a spectacular and eye-catching scene. They could be seen clearly whether it was day or night, like a group of shooting stars that would never fall. The farmers and residents on the ground were shocked speechless when they saw the scene in the sky. Most of them knelt down and prayed incessantly. They didn't dare to stand up until the sword boats and sword lights disappeared into the horizon, wondering where the immortal masters were going and what they were going to do. The major sects closest to the West Sea were the Baodong Zen Temple and the Kunlun sect. He Wei, the sect master of the Kunlun sect, rode the cold signal bird toward the West Sea with dozens of disciples. Normally, they should be the first to arrive at the battlefield, but He Wei felt inexplicably uneasy, so he asked the cold signal bird to slow down. When they arrived at the West Sea, the sky was covered with dark clouds, blocking the sunlight. The seawater was as dark as ink, so they couldn't see what was happening in the depths. The cold signal bird flew toward the islands of the West Sea. Suddenly, it seemed to have sensed a great danger. It let out a fearful cry, turned around, and flew higher into the sky. The cold signal bird didn't stop until it flew hundreds of miles away. It looked at the depths of the West Sea with fear in its eyes. It took the disciples of the Kunlun sect some time to catch up, and their faces were extremely pale. He Wei looked around and found that the sky was full of cultivators. The scholars of Yamatsai, the people of Ozawa and the Platonist sect, the monks of the Guocheng Temple, and many other sects had arrived. More than 1,000 cultivators from dozens of sects had arrived at the West Sea. Compared to the Battle of the Cloud platform all those years ago, such a force was countless times greater. But none of the cultivators dared to approach the islands of the West Sea. Most of them looked fearful. Countless gazes looked toward the depths of the West Sea, toward the islands shrouded in dark clouds. Suddenly, countless bolts of lightning struck down from the dark clouds, striking toward the islands of the West Sea. Boom! Boom! The black sea water tumbled restlessly, producing countless bubbles as if it was boiling. The hard rocks were smashed into pieces, but before they could sink to the bottom of the sea, they were swept up by the hurricane, dancing in the sky. This scene was too shocking, as if it was a punishment from the heavens. The dark clouds suddenly dispersed, and the sunlight shone on the islands of the West Sea. 17 sword boats broke through the clouds, advancing toward the depths of the islands of the West Sea with a slow and unstoppable momentum. The lightning was actually sword energy. End of this chapter. Chapter 500. 17 sword boats of Aoyama were flying on the surface of the ocean. A dozen disciples of Aoyama were sitting on the head of each boat. With their eyes closed, they were driving their flying swords to attack the surface of the ocean nonstop. The flashes of lightning seen by the cultivation practitioners 100 miles away were their flying swords. The sword boats were protected by the formations and guarded by the masters and other swordsmen, so the disciples of Aoyama didn't have to worry about being attacked. As long as they attacked with all their might, the power of their swords would be formidable. The hard rocks and the disciples of Western Sea Sword School who were riding their swords to fight were all minced into pieces by these sword lights. The formidable attacks of the flying swords consumed a lot of their sword source. It didn't take long for these disciples of Aoyama to turn pale, and they were quickly taken away by other disciples of Aoyama to continue the attacks on their swords. The sword lights on the surface of the ocean didn't stop for a single moment. The magic pills and crystals prepared by Shuriwe Peak played an important role at the moment. It was believed that the sword source of these disciples of Aoyama would be replenished soon. The rainstorm-like sword lights bombarded the islands on the surface of the ocean incessantly, creating a formidable scene. Many small islands were flattened along with the deafening booms. Many disciples of Western Sea Sword School were wounded or killed, falling into the ocean. This place wasn't the central area of the West Ocean Islands, so the great formation of the mountain gate couldn't withstand the violent attacks of the sword boats of Aoyama. It didn't take long for the hundreds of islands in the periphery of the West Ocean Islands to be completely wiped out, either destroyed or surrendered. The sword boats of Aoyama didn't continue to attack those islands that surrendered. They sent out a few sword lights to imprison those disciples of West Ocean on the islands using the sword ropes. The 17 sword boats were like 17 huge swords, cutting everything in front of them to pieces as they moved forward on the surface of the ocean. The so-called crushing force was nothing more than this. Hundreds of flying swords of Aoyama's sect were traveling back and forth like the swallows in the sea, stirring up countless huge waves and making the energy in heaven and earth chaotic. No cultivation practitioner dared fly close to the West Ocean Islands to observe the battle, because who could withstand the attack if they were accidentally wounded? Apart from Bu, Xiao, Hiwei, and a scripture-preaching monk of the Guochang Temple, it was hard for them to see all the details of the fight clearly. Most of the cultivators could only see the sword boats of Aoyama moving forward slowly in the rain and wind, and the flying swords that looked like lightning. However, they could clearly sense the power of those flying swords and the despair of the disciples of West Ocean who were in a precarious situation. If it was his own sect, how long could they last against the crushing attacks of the 17 Aoyama sword boats? Many people began to ponder over this question, and soon came to an answer. Their faces became even paler, and their eyes were filled with fear. Hiwei, the sect leader of Kunlun, looked at the ashen-faced disciples, and his expression was very ugly. He was about to scold them, but he found that the cultivators from other sects not far away were also like this. He could not help but sigh in his heart. It had been many years since such a great battle had taken place in the world of cultivators. The younger generation of cultivators had never seen anything like it. Today's scene could easily cast a psychological shadow on these young disciples that was difficult to erase. Besides, Yue had the same feeling. The sword lights of the sword boats of Aoyama didn't stop for even a moment. Soon, he had calculated the amount of crystals and magic pills that the Aoyama sect needed to consume in this battle, which was an unimaginable number. Apart from the Aoyama sect, which other sect in the world could sustain such a violent attack? Even if the Zhongzhou school could, it was impossible for them to be as crazy as the Aoyama sect. The Aoyama sect was very powerful and very powerful. Thinking of this, Yue felt powerless. He led the disciples and flew to a place not far away, joining the cultivators of other sections. Greetings, House Master. Yue came before Bu Xiao and cupped his hands to greet him. The cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school hovered in the high sky, close to the empty realm, showing no sign of descending. The person with the highest status on the scene was Bu Xiao, the House Master of Yamatai. Yue said sentimentally, regardless of whether that matter is true or not, the Aoyama sect attacked without asking any questions. It's too domineering. Are we just going to watch it happen? Bu Xiao looked at the deep heart of the West Sea, saying nothing. There were dozens of scholars of Yamatai on the boat of diligent study in the Sea of Clouds. A thin and dark scholar lifted his head and glanced at Yue. It was then that an elder of the North Brook sect suddenly cried out in surprise. Is that island the hall of heavenly calculation? On the surface of the sea in the southwest, a sword boat of Aoyama arrived in front of a large island. This large island was obviously different from the other islands. It didn't rely on the great formation of the mountain gate of the Western Sea Sword School for protection. Instead, it had its own protective formation. The sword lights from the sword boat of Aoyama were a little messy, but they were blocked by the formation. That formation carried a mysterious aura, as if it could glimpse a corner of the way of heaven. No matter how swift and fierce the flying swords were, they couldn't directly attack the body of the island. It was because of this feeling that the elder of the North Brook sect believed that this large island was the legendary Hall of Heavenly Calculation. The Hall of Heavenly Calculation was a special place of the Western Sea Sword School. It was built by Tian Jinrun, and its formation was indeed extraordinary. Many people thought that the attack of the Aoyama sect was interrupted for the first time, and that the Western Sea Sword School could hold on for a while longer. But a new change took place. A calm and steady voice came from the sword boat of Aoyama. Get into formation. Dozens of flying swords pierced through the sky and weaved a net-like object on the surface of the sea. Electric lights flickered in the net, looking extremely bright. The net of swords drifted toward the large island, and soon met the great formation of the Hall of Heavenly Calculation. With a series of crackling sounds, countless sparks appeared in the sky. Seeing this, Yue's face darkened, and the rest of the cultivators were shocked speechless. Until now, many people remembered that the swordsmanship of the Aoyama sect was certainly the best in the world, but the most powerful one was the sword formation of Aoyama. The flying swords couldn't destroy the formation directly, but what about the sword formation of Aoyama? When the two formations met, the stronger one would win, and the weaker one would be destroyed. The wind was howling, and the seawater was evaporated into white smoke. The great formation of the Hall of Heavenly Calculation was broken in an instant. The large island appeared in front of everyone. You're too arrogant. An angry and violent voice came from the island. A figure soared into the sky, holding a magic weapon in his hand, which emitted thousands of light rays. He dashed toward the net-like sword formation in the sky. No one knew what that magic weapon was, but it wasn't destroyed by the sword intent of Aoyama's sword formation. It was like a fish that was about to break out of the net, causing a bulge in the sword formation. It was the current master of the Hall of Heavenly Calculation, Chi Magia, and the magic weapon in his hand came from White Deer Institute. Just as he was about to tear the sword formation apart, a loud crack suddenly resounded in the sky. A bolt of lightning descended from the sky. Countless waves rose on the surface of the sea, and the tide was endless. The bolt of lightning pierced through the sword formation and accurately landed on the magic weapon in Chi Magia's hand. It was a loud bang. Chi Magia, felt as if he was really struck by lightning. His body stiffened and emitted countless puffs of white smoke. Just like that, he fell into the sea, his fate unknown. The magic weapon was indeed not ordinary. It wasn't destroyed by the flying sword, but it naturally lost its power after losing its master. It was actually dragged back to the sword boat by Aoi Misek's sword formation. The bolt of lightning was extremely bright, and even the surface of the sea was illuminated by it. Seeing this scene, all the cultivators were stunned. They thought that the Western Sea Sword School could turn the situation around, but who would have thought that Chi would be severely injured and fall into the sea in the blink of an eye, and that the magic weapon was taken away by Aoi Misek. Aoi Misek's attack continued, and the sword boat landed on the big island. The tide came in response to the sword intent, and it kept beating against the cliff of the island. Dozens of sword lights kept falling, and the rumbling sound didn't stop. The buildings on the big island were destroyed in an instant. For the cultivators who were watching the battle, what happened next was no longer important. They were still thinking about the sword that was like a real bolt of lightning. What a powerful sword. The elder of the Northbrook sect was extremely respectful and fearful, and he murmured, "What sword is this? Did immortal Lu Ci personally make a move?" Many cultivators were also guessing, thinking that since the powerful cultivator of the Western Sea was cut down by a single sword strike, it should be either immortal Lu Ci or Lord Yuan Shijing. This is the Tide Sword, and it uses the octagonal sword technique. Yue had an unsightly look on his face as he said, "It was Chun Yutian who attacked." Hearing this, all the voices of discussion disappeared. The cultivators felt that this was unbelievable. Chun Yutan was the peak master of Bihu of the Aoyama sect. He hadn't been a swordsman of the Broken Sea State for many years, and he was the weakest peak master of the Aoyama sect. Of course, Zhao Liu, who was an anomaly, wasn't included. However, this weakest peak master had killed Qi Mashu instantly with his sword, as swift as a bolt of lightning. In fact, Chun Yotian's cultivation state wasn't much higher than Qi Mashu's, but Qi Mashu's magic treasure was restrained by the sword net of the Aoyama sect. While Chun Yutian had been accumulating energy for a long time, and he was guided by the sword formation of the disciples of Bihu Peak. Thousands of tides were like a huge mountain, and when his sword fell down, it was like the collapse of a mountain. How could Qi Mashu resist it? A sword boat of the Aoyama sect encountered real resistance for the first time. There was a black rock mountain on that island. The disciples of the Western Sea Sword School were fighting fiercely with the disciples of the Aoyama sect on the sword boat by relying on the caves in the mountain. The flying swords kept colliding with each other. Countless sword lights collided with each other, giving off dazzling lights. Occasionally, some flying swords missed, leaving marks of different depths on the mountain and the belly of the sword boat. The disciples of the Aoyama sect were protected by the sword boat, and the disciples of the Western Sea Sword School were protected by the Black Rock Mountain. The battle was in a deadlock. Suddenly, two flying swords flew out of the sword boat, one black and one white sword light, and bombarded the Black Rock Mountain. The Black Rock Mountain was extremely hard, and it was supported by a formation. Even if the flying swords of the disciples of the Aoyama sect hit it directly, they could only bring out some stone chips. However, the two sword lights pierced through the mountain, and then collided with each other in the belly of the mountain, cutting the mountain in half. With a loud rumbling sound, the Black Rock Mountain collapsed slowly. The disciples of the Western Sea Sword School screamed in surprise, riding their swords to escape to the surface of the sea. Seeing this, the cultivation practitioners in the distance were shocked, speechless again. The elder of the Northbrook sect said in a trembling voice, "It's too powerful. It must be the 3-foot sword of the immortal Yuan, right?" He had never seen the 3-foot sword, but he remembered that Yuan Shijing was the sword justice of the Aoyama sect, famous for his uprightness and outspokenness, and the Shanghai Peak was famous for its black mountain and white snow, which matched the two sword lights. Besides, who else could cut the Black Rock Mountain in half with such a formidable power, except for Yuan Shijing? It's Mo Qi, and by Ruging from the Tianguang Peak. Bu Qiuxiao said expressionlessly, They are both swordsmen in the broken sea state. The crowd fell silent again. In the depths of the West Sea Islands, a swordsman suddenly flew up, arriving along with the rain and wind of the sea. He was the elder of the Western Sea Sword School, who had cultivated deeply in the broken sea state for many years. Seeing this scene, the cultivation practitioners watching the fight finally became spirited. The sword boat moved slightly, and a Taoist in indigo suddenly showed up in the sky, blocking the way of the elder of the Western Sea Sword School. The clear and beautiful sunlight sprinkled on his body, and suddenly 6 sword lights appeared in it. The sword of the returning sun. The sword style of 6 dragons. The sword lights flashed. The elder of the Western Sea Sword School was cut in half, falling down. The Taoist in indigo flew back to the sword boat. It was quiet in heaven and earth. The cultivation practitioners watching the fight were shocked speechless. He Wei's face was livid, thinking that even he couldn't block this sword. Bu Xiaoxiao thought in silence that if he didn't have the dragon tail inkstone, he could only fight to a draw with this Taoist in indigo. 2 light sounds suddenly came over the quiet surface of the sea. It was the sound of the 2 halves of the elder of the Western Sea Sword School falling into the sea. The cultivation practitioners finally came to their senses from the shock. Who was this Taoist in indigo? What sword was this? It was so powerful. Even He Wei and Bu Xiaoxiao didn't know the identity of this Taoist in indigo. Nobody dared to make any more guesses, and they felt more reverence for the Aoyama sect. Everybody knew that the Aoyama sword sect was very powerful. But why didn't anybody know about this Taoist in indigo who was so powerful? Had the Aoyama sect become so powerful? Bu Xiaoxiao turned his head to look at the thin and dark scholar on the boat of diligent study. This thin and dark scholar was Lu Shui. Lu Shui said, "He is Guang Yu Engineer of Shuriwe Peak. When I designed this plot last year, I liked the way the Aoyama sword boat was the most. The spaceship would shoot lasers and sweep the ground. When it encountered a fortress with a strong defense, it would fire the laser cannon and bombard it. It was so cool." End of this chapter. Chapter 501. It's him, Bu Xiaoxiao said thoughtfully. I heard that he had reached the upper limit of the broken sea state a long time ago. It looks like he is indeed extraordinary today. He, of course, had heard of this master of Shuriwe Peak in Aoyama. However, this immortal had always kept a low profile and stayed behind closed doors over the years, so the 2 of them had never met. He Wei and the other sect masters nodded in silence. Those regular disciples had never heard of this name, and they were still in a state of shock and bewilderment. How could the Aoyama sect have such a formidable swordsman? The nearby patch of sea surface was surging again. The sword boat of Aoyama was flying very close to the surface of the sea, and the sword lights were few and far between. Dozens of shadows suddenly appeared under the surface of the sea, which should be the sea demons trained by the Western Sea Sword School. A blood-red sword light broke through the surface of the sea and traveled at a high speed in the sea, bringing up boiling steam and a great deal of blood. Then it turned back. It could be vaguely seen that those shadows had disintegrated and were sinking to the bottom of the sea. The power of this blood-red sword light was not as powerful as the flying swords of Junrin and those elders, but it had a strong mental impact on the cultivation practitioners. The seawater within a radius of a few miles was dyed red, looking like a boundless pool of blood. It was a bloody scene. No one asked any questions this time. They all knew that this blood-red flying sword was the legendary Thoughtless Sword. Zhao Liu had reached the middle state of free travel at such a young age. How did she lose to Zhuoruzhui? Jinren didn't come out after he returned to the sword boat. So did Qin Yutian, Imo Qi, Bai Rujing, and other swordsmen of Aoyama. Even Zhao Liu wielded her sword only once. The masters of the previous generation of Aoyama would wield their swords only when they encountered a difficult problem. The regular disciples of Aoyama were still the main force at other times. The deeper they went into the West Ocean Islands, the more opportunities they had to use the deadly sword skills that the disciples of Liangwang Peak had to practice to kill demons. The flying swords swept over the surface of the sea like raindrops. The most frightening thing was that no matter what the Western Sea Sword School did, Aoyama's sect could always find the most suitable way to counter it. The snowfall at Shangda Peak, the thunderstorm at Bihu Peak, and the formation at Tianguang Peak. The simplest flying sword could mimic countless kinds of magical powers and then break the magic treasures and formations of the Western Sea Sword School at will. Immortal Lu Cai and Yuan Qijing hadn't even made their moves, and there were still many famous swords of the immortal grade that hadn't appeared, but the Western Sea Sword School had already been beaten to the point that they couldn't fight back. This was a true suppression. Looking at the magnificent yet not intense battle on the surface of the sea, Kunlun's sect master, He Wei, suddenly asked, "How many days have they been fighting for?" Bu Qiuxiao raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "It will start when we arrive." After learning that Taiping Zhenren had come out from behind closed doors and was hiding at the West Ocean, the scholars of Yamatai reacted the fastest and arrived the earliest. The Aoyama sect could have started the attack in advance, but they waited until the cultivation practitioners of other sects arrived. What did this mean? The Aoyama sect intended to wage this war for all of Chaotian to watch, so they needed an audience. Having figured this out, the cultivation practitioners of various sects were stunned speechless. The Western Sea Sword School was a new major sect in the last 100 years, and they had suppressed the No Mercy sect, a powerful sect. Even though the Western Sea Sword School suffered a great deal of damage after the Cloud Platform, they were still one of the most powerful sects in the world. Yet the Aoyama sect attacked whenever they wanted. How confident they were! The 17 sword boats of Aoyama headed toward the deep part of the West Ocean Islands. The sword lights gradually faded away, leaving behind the bloody scars on the surface of the ocean and a great deal of fresh blood. The ocean rain fell on the ocean and the islands along with the heavenly wind, washing away the blood and covering the smoke and dust caused by the collapse of the buildings. Seeing this, the cultivators of the various sects felt a strong sense of helplessness. This is war. Looking at the fading bloody scars on the surface of the ocean and the ruined islands, Bu Qiuxiao said after a moment of silence, "The true strength of a sect can only be determined through war. As such, I have a high opinion of the Windy Broadsword sect. It's because they have participated in the war, and they have grown stronger in the war." He said this to the disciples of Yamatai on the boat of diligent study, as a form of instruction. In the war in the human world, the personal prowess of a general was meaningless. In the war in the cultivation world, the personal cultivation state of a cultivation practitioner was meaningless, unless he had reached the Dachan state or the heavenly arrival state. Only then could he change the situation. However, how many figures in the heavenly arrival state were there in the cultivation world? The Aoyama sect had 2 of them. What was depressing was that the Aoyama sect had 4 principal guards. Many people looked up at the sky reflexively. A huge ship could be vaguely seen among the thin clouds close to the empty realm. It was the cloud ship of the Zhongzhou school. Many swordsmen of the Cloud Dream Mountain were on the ship, and it was said that even Bai Zhenren had come. In terms of resources, swordsmen, and the number of high-level flying swords and magic treasures, perhaps only the Zhongzhou school could compete with the Aoyama sect. Who will be the final winner if the 2 sects started a war? Nobody dared to raise this question, but they were all thinking about it in silence. Bu Qiuxiao shook his head while looking at those disciples who were deep in thought. He thought it was meaningless to think about it. After witnessing the momentum and boldness of the Aoyama sect today, did anyone still think that the Zhongzhou school had a chance of winning? Lu Shui didn't think about it. As a talented disciple of the Aoyama sect, he of course believed that the Aoyama sect would win. No matter whether it was the war with the Western Sea Sword School or the war with the Zhongzhou school he had imagined. Standing on the boat of diligent study, he sighed as he watched the sword boat sail toward the distance. That sword boat had the fewest sword lights, and it was evident that it had fewer disciples, and Zhao Liu was on it. It must be the sword boat of the Shenma Peak. He felt proud that the Aoyama sect had suppressed the West Ocean Sword School, but he also felt a bit regretful. If so many things hadn't happened, he would have been on that sword boat. A deep, buzzing sound burst out, and the sword bracelet on his wrist was vibrating incessantly. The lone sword, as the main sword of Liangwang Peak, wanted to go to the Aoyama sect to kill the enemy with its companions. Lu Shui stroked the sword bracelet to comfort him, thinking that if the godly swordsman of West Ocean didn't show up, Aoyama sect would definitely win. Why should he and Lu Shui go? If the godly swordsman of West Ocean showed up, what else could he do? And Lu Shui would definitely pretend to be asleep. It was true that everybody knew that the Aoyama sect would win this war, but nobody was sure how much the Aoyama sect would pay and how many people would die. It was because the godly swordsman of West Ocean hadn't shown up yet. The rainwater suddenly disappeared, and the wind disappeared without a trace. Yet, countless tides rose up on the surface of the ocean. Bihu Peak of Aoyama employed the tide sword style, but it was not as fast as the tide. The word tide was also included in the supreme sword instruction of the Western Sea Sword School. The tides rose up and landed on the surface of the sword boat, producing countless snowflakes. The sword boat in the front swayed a few times and then stabilized its position. The disciples of Tianguang Peak retrieved their flying swords and stared at the place where the tides rose up as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Even Zhuo Ruzhui lifted his drooping eyelids, feeling a bit excited. It was a sword that caused countless tides to rise up at the West Ocean. The flying sword was made up of many pieces, looking like the pagodas in the Zen temples or the tides overlapping each other. The name of the sword was the 12-story building. This sword was ranked in the top of the list of famous swords of the fairy state in the world. 200 years ago, this sword was no different from a piece of scrap metal when it was picked up by a certain someone on the beach for the first time. As that person's cultivation state grew higher and higher, the state of the 12-story building sword grew higher and higher. It was a flying sword of the fairy state now, almost as powerful as the first child sword. The sword rose up with the person, so that person was more famous and more outstanding. That person gave himself a Taoist name, One Sword from the West. The important figures of the same generation were used to calling him Sword from the West. The lazy seniors were used to calling him Sword from the West. The majority of the cultivation practitioners called him Godly Swordsman of West Ocean. Since he was called Godly Swordsman, it was evident that he had a high attainment in the sword work and a profound cultivation state. The cultivation circle didn't have a high opinion of the Godly Swordsman. They thought that he was gloomy, taciturn, and narrow-minded, lacking the demeanor of a ferryman. Under such circumstances, he was still regarded as one of the strongest swordsmen in Chaotian. It was evident that his prowess was impeccable. In the last few decades, his cultivation state was at its peak. The immortal Lu Xi was on par with him in the sword fight, and Pei Baifa was knocked down to the West Ocean by his sword. The godly swordsman of West Ocean could be said to be the strongest swordsman in Chaotian, on par with the three immortals Lu Xi and Tan Bai. Back then, there was an opinion that the godly swordsman of West Ocean was inferior to the broadsword king, but this opinion was no longer the case. When the 12-story building sword appeared amid the violent tides, who of the Aoyama sect could resist it? In a huge sword boat in the front, Lu Xi stood at the bow of the boat, his robe tousling slightly. He looked at the sword with narrowed eyes, but he had no intention of wielding his sword. It was because he didn't have a sword, and the sheath of the inherited heaven sword was prepared for someone else. Yuan Qijing didn't wield his sword either. He sat quietly in the cabin, waiting for the arrival of the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island. The rooster paced back and forth in the cabin with his devilish long tail, saying anxiously, "Where is that old devil? Where is he? I'm so worried." Yuan Qijing shot him a glance, knowing that he was not worried about the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island, Nanshu, but someone else. The sword lights illuminated the surface of the ocean. 3 flying swords arrived after breaking through the air and surrounded the 12-story building sword. These 3 flying swords were obviously human, and their sword wills were like crystals. It was evident that they were all flying swords of the fairy state. It was the absolute sword of Yunxing Peak. It was the sword of the returning sun of Shuriwa Peak. And it was the sword of the 8 sides of Bihu Peak. Zhao Leiyu's cultivation state was too low, so she wasn't qualified to participate in a fight of such a high level. As such, the thoughtless sword didn't show up. The Aoyama sect is really proud. They sent only 3 peak masters to welcome them. Looking at the scene in the distance, He Wei said with a hint of jealousy and malice, even if Guan Yu and Jinren could resist them for a while, the other 2 would be killed instantly. Lu Shui shot a glance at this person, and then looked at his wrist, and found that the lone sword didn't move at all. The tide had gradually receded. The figure behind the 12-story building's sword became more visible. The godly swordsman of West Ocean had finally shown up. Facing 3 famous swords of Aoyama and 17 sword boats of Aoyama, he didn't show any fear on his face. He was as indifferent and dull as usual, like a stone statue. What do you intend to do? The godly swordsman of West Ocean looked at the sword boat a few miles away, his voice emotionless. The immortal Lu Ci stood at the bow of the boat, his Taoist robe fluttering, looking like a ferryman. "My master, please come back to the mountain," he said in a pleasant voice as sweet as the sweet dew. Hearing this, the godly swordsman of West Ocean sighed inwardly, even though he looked calm. According to his original plan, Taiping Jinren would come to the West Ocean to steal the sword, and he would be killed or captured by him and the young mysterious Dark Master together. And then the devil and Aoyama would be lured over to kill him. Unexpectedly, the sword sect of Aoyama had come before he could strike, and they had come in full force. The godly swordsman of West Ocean said expressionlessly, "Your Aoyama sect didn't keep an eye on him and let him escape. Why do you come to us?" Lu Ci didn't answer him. A bright yellow scroll came from the east, hovering in the sky. The inky words on the scroll rose up along with the ocean wind, appearing very clear under the sunlight, and all the cultivation practitioners could see them. It was stated in the royal decree that the Mingqing Heavenly Bureau and the curtain rollers had found out that Taiping Jinren was at the West Ocean, and all the orthodox cultivation sects were requested to cooperate with the Aoyama sect. The ocean wind ruffled the surface of the water, and the golden glow gradually dispersed. It was very quiet. No cultivation practitioner would follow the Aoyama sect to attack the Western Sea Sword School, not even the Platonist sect or the Ozawa sect. Everybody knew that the Aoyama sect didn't need any help, but they needed a reason to attack the West Ocean. As such, the emperor wrote a royal decree for them. Without any evidence, the royal decree is useless. The godly swordsman of West Ocean said expressionlessly, "The Aoyama sect claims to be the leader of the orthodox cultivation sects, but they have killed so many innocent people today. I don't need all the cultivation sects here to be witnesses. All I want to know is how you people will face your ancestors in the future." Lu Ci said lightly, "Open the great formation of the mountain gate. If my master is not here, the Aoyama sect will apologize for their mistake." Though the apology sounded casual, everybody could imagine that if Taiping Jinren was not on the islands of the West Ocean, the price Aoyama sect would have to pay would be much more than a few casualties. The fact that Lu Ci dared to say so indicated that Aoyama's sect was indeed confident. Countless gazes were fixed on the godly swordsman of West Ocean, wondering what choice he would make. The godly swordsman of West Ocean lowered his eyelids slightly. Back when he asked Su Zai to tell Taiping Jinren that the first child sword was on Tianxian Island, he intended to lure him to the West Ocean. However, he didn't even know if Taiping Jinren was at the West Ocean at the moment. If he was, why didn't he know? If he was not, why did Lu Ci dare say so? He was truly not good at scheming and scheming. The godly swordsman of West Ocean let out a self-mocking smile, and then said to Lu Ci calmly, "It's easy to come in. Let's fight." No sooner had he said this than a formidable sword came out from the deep end of the islands of the West Ocean, and the great formation was activated to an extreme extent. A huge shadow rose slowly from the bottom of the ocean. It should be the divine guardian animal of the Western Sea Sword School, the flying whale. The cultivation practitioners of various sects had a grave expression on their faces. The West Ocean Sword sect was determined to destroy both the good and the bad. This place was the central area of the islands of the West Ocean, so the great formation of the mountain gate of the Western Sea Sword School could exert a formidable power. No matter how powerful the Aoyama sect was, they would have to pay a great price in order to breach the great formation of the mountain gate, and many people would die. If the great formation of the mountain gate of a sect could be breached so easily, how could the mysterious dark sect survive under the gaze of the Aoyama sect until now? What the godly swordsmen of West Ocean meant was clear. No matter what scheme the Aoyama sect had, Lu Si would deal with it head-on with blood and death. Lu Si remained silent for a long time, as if he was trying to decide if it was worth it. It was quiet in heaven and earth. The godly swordsman of West Ocean suddenly sensed something. He turned his head abruptly to look at a spot in the ocean, a shocked and angry expression showing on his face. By now he realized that Lu Si was not judging the pros and cons, but was waiting. There was an island on the other side of the ocean called Xiaoming Island, about 100 miles away from here. It looked ordinary, but it was the center of the great formation of the mountain gate. Along with a heavy grinding sound, the huge rock on the island changed its position slowly. Everybody sensed the abrupt change in the energy of heaven and earth. The eaves were broken when the rain fell, and the doors were opened when the thieves came. The great formation of the mountain gate of the Western Sea Sword School had been opened. The fog on the islands dispersed, revealing their true forms under the sunlight. There was a mountain on Xiaoming Island. There was a tower on the top of the mountain. There was an ordinary old elm chair on the tower. Insan was drinking tea in the chair. His appearance was delicate and handsome, with an amiable smile on his face, as if he thought the tea in the cup was the most delicious thing in the world. Sensing that the great formation of the mountain gate had been opened, he seemed to feel surprised, looking at the outside of the island. There were 17 sword boats of Aoyama in the sky. He stood up slowly while holding the teacup, a complicated emotion showing in his eyes. In the end, his line of sight fell on the immortal Lu Si. The expression in his eyes grew colder, and his eyebrows raised. "You wicked disciple, you've chased me all the way here. Do you really want to fight me to the death? They're so handsome. I don't mean to boast, but this pair of brothers are definitely the best in fighting, shameless and pretentious." Chapter 502. Nobody knew who this young man was. Yet, he dared call Lu Si a wicked disciple, and Lu Si acquiesced. This young man must be Tai Ping Jinren. Few people knew the secret of Tai Ping Jinren, but the sect masters of various sects knew it. Looking at the young man on the platform, they remained silent, feeling sentimental and complicated. All of them were thinking of the same thing. This troublemaker was still alive. The cultivation practitioners who didn't know what had happened were still in a state of confusion, including most of the disciples of Aoyama. This was the first time they had seen the Grandmaster. They had seen the portrait in the small building before. Some of them felt something was wrong, but they didn't know what the problem was. Lu Shui had gone to Bulow Lin to organize the files for many years, so he was sensitive to conspiracies. As a result, he found the problem quickly. When the Aoyama sect attacked the West Ocean, the Imperial Court and the curtain rollers brought the evidence. Aoyama needed to open the great formation of the mountain gate of the Western Sea Sword School, so it was opened. Aoyama needed to find Tai Ping Jinren, so he sat in the chair and drank tea, letting the whole world see him. As the peak master of Qingrong said, Aoyama had 4 seasons for seasons for seasons and 4 seasons. All of this happened so naturally that it was unimaginably natural. He Wei shot a glance at Bu Qiuxiao. Bu Qiuxiao furrowed his brows. They all thought something was wrong. Looking at the small island in the distance, Bai Junren said expressionlessly, "Why didn't he flee when the battle was going on outside? Why did he sit in the chair and drink tea?" Bai Zhao shot a glance at his mother. Bai Junren said lightly, "He acted too much." Bai Zhao was startled, wondering if he meant that Tai Ping Jinren and Aoyama had acted together. But Wasn't Taiping Zhenren imprisoned in the sword jail by the immortal Lu in Yuan Qijing? Didn't Aoyama invade the West Ocean to capture him and bring him back? Bai Zhenren said. The purpose and reason can be changed at any time. You should know that Aoyama is best at external warfare, followed by internal warfare. Whether it was an external or internal battle, it was still a battle. Bai Zhao seemed to have understood something. He looked at the vast sea, trying to find Jing Jiu's figure, but he couldn't find him. He felt inexplicably uneasy. What we need to do is to help Aoyama remember their true purpose. If they forget, we'll do it ourselves. Bai Zhenren said as he looked at the approaching island. While they were talking, the cloud boat kept moving, heading towards Xiaoming Island at its fastest speed. At the same time, Yamatai's boat of diligent study and the cultivators of other sects were quickly heading in that direction. Whether it was Zhongzhou School, Yamatai, or Guocheng Temple, none of them would let Taiping Zhenren escape. Don't let him escape. The expression in Lu Ci's eyes was a bit complicated, but his voice was still elegant and peaceful. A huge sword boat had already arrived in front of Xiaoming Island. A violent snowstorm suddenly occurred in the sky, and the surface of the ocean froze instantly, extending to the bottom of the ocean until the bottom of the ocean was completely frozen. The 3-foot sword returned after breaking through the ocean. Yuan Qijing had cut off all the escape routes for Taiping Zhenren. It was truly a cruel move. Looking at the young man on Xiaoming Island, the godly swordsman of West Ocean suddenly waved his hand. His sleeve was fluttering, and the tide was rolling. The sword of the 12-story building was invisible amid the real and fake snowflakes. As it reappeared, it had already arrived on Xiaoming Island 100 miles away. The seemingly casual swing of the sword was actually unleashed with fury, and its power was unimaginably powerful. Crack! A part of the mountain on Xiaoming Island was cut off, like a conical hat worn by a person being cut in half. The stone stool, the tables, chairs, and teacups on it had all disappeared along with the part of the cliff. Where was that young man? Only a few people noticed that a band of black smoke came out from the cliff when the sword of the 12-story building arrived on Xiaoming Island. The black smoke contained the purest and most profound, gloomy energy. Those who knew the history of the Guocheng Temple had guessed that the great Grand Master of the mysterious dark sect should be by Taiping Zhenren's side, and it was he who had blocked the swing of the sword. The immortal Lu Ci took a step forward and came to the front of the boat. His white hair was tousled by the ocean wind, making him look like a ferryman. Looking at the godly swordsman of West Ocean, he said calmly, "You killed your young brother Shuang's son with one swing of the sword on the cloud platform back then. Do you intend to use the same trick to silence him today?" The godly swordsman of West Ocean thought that it was meaningless to talk about it at the moment. It was not him who killed Taiping and lured out the ghost of Aoyama, but Taiping who lured out Aoyama to kill him. He said expressionlessly, "Do you think you and your disciple could deceive the people in the world after putting on such a good show? And do you think you can gain any advantage?" The immortal Lu Ci asked. The meaning of this was rather complicated. It meant that he didn't understand what he was talking about. The flying boats of various sects had surrounded Xiaoming Island. The sword lights and the precious wills were everywhere, both in the sky and on the surface of the ocean. The seawater had been frozen into solid ice, so they couldn't leave the island quietly. It seemed that Taiping Zhenren would die if he was trapped on the island. The Aoyama sect and the Western Sea Sword School were at war, and none of the sects dared get close to them. But why did they suddenly take action? Many cultivation practitioners didn't understand what was going on. In fact, most of the disciples of Aoyama didn't understand why their sect wanted to find the great Grand Master and why they wanted to start a war with the West Ocean. They were still confused until now. Thinking of the recent turmoil in Chaotian and the nervous reactions of the various sects and the imperial court, they were even more puzzled. The appearance of Taiping Zhenren shocked the world. Why? In the royal palace of Zhaoga City. Looking at Prince Jing Yao, who had grown into a young man, Gu Qing said, "This war looks complicated, but it's actually quite simple." Our Aoyama sect has always wanted to wipe out the West Ocean, but we haven't found a suitable reason to do so. Now that we have found a suitable reason, we won't miss it. Jing Yao asked, "Is this what teachers said a few days ago?" "That's right," Gu Qing said. "Taiping Jinren is the best reason." Jing Yao felt even more puzzled, asking why. Gu Qing said, "It's because he is the public enemy of Chao Tian. If the West Ocean dares take him in, the whole world will be enraged." The so-called public enemy was the enemy of the whole world, and they couldn't live under the same sky. Even the Aoyama sect had to abide by this principle. Jing Yao was shocked speechless. His eyes opened wider than the jade egg of Rosefinch, and he asked in a trembling voice, "Isn't the immortal behind closed doors in Aoyama?" After a moment of silence, Gu Qing said, "It looks like the so-called behind closed doors means that he has been imprisoned in the sword jail." He had learned of these secrets only recently, but he still didn't know what Taiping Jinren had done back then. Jing Yao couldn't understand it at all, wondering how the Aoyama sect was the leader of the orthodox sects, and Taiping Jinren was the sect master of the previous generation. How could he become the public enemy of Chao Tian? More importantly, he couldn't understand it. If Taiping Jinren was imprisoned in the sword jail when he stayed behind closed doors, the immortal sect master and the master sword justice were betraying their masters and destroying their ancestors. All you need to know is that nobody will allow Taiping Jinren to live. Gu Qing continued while staring into Jing Yao's eyes. "I'm sure no sect will intervene in the war between Aoyama and the West Ocean, or in other words, dare to intervene. However, as long as Taiping Jinren shows up, all the orthodox sects will strike, and they have to." In the eyes of the cultivation circle, the life and death of Taiping Jinren were much more important than the outcome of the war. The fact was that the purpose of starting a war was of course more important than the war itself. Jing Yao came back to his senses and said worriedly, "Doesn't it mean that our Aoyama sect will be besieged? Just like other sects, Aoyama won't let him live." After a moment of silence, Gu Qing said, "Of course, some disciples of Aoyama might have a different opinion." Standing in the corridor of the Grand Hall, the Emperor said while looking at the western sky, "The system of the plum meeting was actually designed by Taiping Jinren, but it was he who wanted to overthrow it later on." Looking at his profile, royal concubine who thought that the Emperor was indeed handsome, but he was also a bit foolish. He told her all this, even though he knew that she couldn't understand what he was talking about. What the hell was the system of the plum meeting? Yet, it sounded like that Taiping Jinren was an extraordinary person. He's an extraordinary figure. It's very difficult for him to deny what he was in the past, and he will have to bleed a lot. The Emperor continued, "During those 100 years, Chao Tian was in turmoil, and people were bleeding incessantly. He was on the brink of death. During those 100 years, the Snowy Kingdom didn't invade the south, and the underworld didn't invade, but there were endless natural and man-made disasters. The most troublesome part was that Emperor Shao caused chaos in the imperial court and started a rebellion. The number of people who died during those years was even more than the number of people who died during the Snowy Kingdom's invasion and the Underworld's invasion. According to the estimation of the later historians and the records of the imperial court, the number of unnatural deaths during those 100 years was more than 300 million. Royal concubine who didn't have a direct concept of this number, so she felt cold instinctively. This is not recorded in the history books, and the records of the imperial court are sealed. Looking at the reddish sky, the emperor recalled those years and said in a cold voice, "Plague, flood, earthquake, heavenly fire. That's about it." Royal concubine who realized that the emperor didn't intend to tell her all this, but he used this method to recall the years he didn't want to recall. She held his hand and rubbed her face against it, asking softly, "What does this immortal want to do?" It was true. What did Taiping Jinren want to do? The plague, the flood, the earthquake, and the heavenly fire could only kill the mortals, and they couldn't threaten the cultivation practitioners. The emperor said, "He wants to kill all the mortals." Royal concubine who was startled, asking what? The emperor said, "He wants to create a world with no mortals, but only cultivation practitioners." royal concubine who felt it was ridiculous and laughed out in surprise. How is it possible? The emperor said after a moment of silence, but he has been doing it all along. The two thin chickens and the green vegetable leaves in the small courtyard in Jiaoga City had disappeared without a trace, and the owner of the house had changed twice. Shi Fengshan had died in that small courtyard. Before his death, he told Jingjiu that the reason he had to kill Zhao Liu was because Zhao Liu wasn't afraid of killing people, and she would kill people at all costs to practice her Dao. And this was the biggest disaster, because he was afraid that Zhao Liu would become the second Taiping Zhenren. Jingjiu had read the records in the secret files of the Pure Heaven Bureau, so he knew what Taiping Zhenren had done. Jingjiu knew more about it, so he could understand Shi Fengshan's fear. Of course, it didn't mean that Shi Fengshan wanted to live after killing Zhao Liu. Zhao Liu was indeed similar to Taiping Zhenren when he was young. They were both geniuses in cultivation, full of passion and love for this world, and they liked hot pot, and they had no fear of killing people. Fortunately, Zhao Liu was becoming more and more like him. What about Lu Shui? What about those people in the Aoyama? Jingjiu's line of sight passed through the wild grass and fell on Nanwang. The Battle of the West Ocean started with the two letters from his big brother. The Aoyama was indeed going to destroy the West Ocean. Jingjiu also wanted to see who that devil was. When his big brother was besieged by the whole world, would that devil be able to endure it? Of course, Jingjiu had something more important to do, which was to deal with the old devil in the black coffin. The red lanterns in the ruined temple were swaying in the wind. Jingjiu got up and walked in that direction. Chapter 503. Insan was at most in the free travel state, and not the true Taiping Zhenren yet. Jingjiu was fully aware that his body was not healthy enough to pose a real threat to the Aoyama sect. The biggest enemies of the Aoyama sect were still the master and disciple, Nanchu and Jianshilai. Seeing the ruined temple getting closer and the red lantern swaying in the wind, Jingjiu repeated the calculations he had made in the last few days. Nanchu's first child sword had been taken by the Aoyama sect back then, and had been kept in the royal palace until the Battle of the Cloud Platform. It was brought back to the Western Sea Sword School in the end. The Aoyama sect was certain that the West Ocean hadn't returned the first child sword to the Foggy Island. Why did Nanchu take back his sword? The others couldn't figure it out, but Jingjiu had guessed a possibility based on his experience. Nanchu had tempered himself into a sword ghost, so he had no need for the first child sword. If this was the case, where was Nanchu's sword ghost now? Was it the West Ocean or the Aoyama sect? More importantly, if Nanchu's sword ghost had gone to another place, what would be the Nanchu in the black coffin? A cold corpse or something like a sheath? Would the Nanchu in the coffin wake up? As he was thinking of all this, Jingjiu followed Nanwang to the outside of the ruined temple. The Aoyama sect had already struck at the West Ocean, and it was time for them to destroy this red lantern. The red lantern was probably the magic of the southern barbaric tribes, which could call back Nanchu's sword ghost from 10,000 miles away. If they wanted to kill Nanchu, they had to destroy it. Nanzheng walked out from the ruined temple, seeing the silvery bells all over her body, who looked a bit like her, but was more arrogant. An incredulous expression showed on her face. Back when Nanwang became the peak master of Qingrong in the Aoyama sect, he had eliminated all the remnants of Nanchu's branch in the tribe. Nanzheng was one of those people. Her hatred towards her was naturally as deep as the ocean. Even though she knew that she was no match for her, she still attacked her. Nanwang gently flicked his 10 fingers, and countless faintly discernible sword strings appeared around the dilapidated temple, weaving into a net. The mountain breeze fell on those sword strings, producing clear sounds of different pitches. It was very moving. Bang! 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 Nanzheng was sent flying backward with blood oozing out her body. She crashed into the back wall of the old temple and smashed into the mountain. It was unknown whether she was dead or alive. Nanwang ignored her. He walked to the red lantern in front of the dilapidated temple and closed his eyes. She was the true god worshipped by the southern barbaric tribes, so she had a way to dismantle Nanchu's magic, but she had to pay a price. A moment later, her body swayed twice, and her face turned pale. The red lantern spontaneously combusted and was soon reduced to ashes. Nan Wang opened his eyes and looked at the black coffin in the temple, motioning for Jing Jiao to stand behind him. Crouching on Jing Jiao's shoulder, the white cat looked at the black coffin, his eyes full of vigilance and fear. The long hair on his body stood on end, looking like an angry dandelion. Nan Wang walked into the ruined temple and came before the black coffin. He bit his finger and knocked twice on the lid of the coffin. The lid of the black coffin slid down slowly, exposing Nanchu's skinny, short, and old body. Nan Wang fell silent for a while, his chest rising and falling slightly. Soon after, his right hand struck down as fast as lightning, hitting Nanchu's chest. Huh! Countless bright rays of light shot out from her eyes. As her right hand fell, the sword strings around the dilapidated temple wrapped around the black coffin like a fishing net. It was soundless. The black coffin was crushed into the finest powder, and Nanchu's clothing was also crushed into similar fine particles. Yet, Nanchu's body was not damaged at all. He was still as skinny as before, looking like a dried corpse. Nan Wang's eyes grew brighter. He exerted his sword wills to the extreme and kept on attacking with the endless sword style. Pah! Pah! The sword strings were broken one after another, curling up and returning to the original body of the zither sword. The zither sword grew dimmer. It was evident that it was severely damaged. Nan Wang fell silent, thinking that no matter how high his cultivation state was, it was impossible for him to resist the flying swords with his body alone. Seeing this, Jing Jiao realized that his prediction was not complete. The broken pieces were scattered all over the ground in the ruined temple. The burning red lantern turned into a few puffs of green smoke. Nanchu opened his eyes and said, "I didn't expect you to find me." The seawater around Xiaoming Island had turned into ice. Taiping Jinren couldn't escape from the bottom of the ocean, so he had no choice but to hide on the island. The cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school, the boat of diligent study of Yamatai, and a lotus cloud of the Guoqing temple had all arrived in this part of the island, encircling it. As the great formation of the mountain gate of the West Ocean was activated, the huge shadow in the ocean was heading towards Xiaoming Island at a high speed. It was the divine guardian animal of the Western Sea Sword School, the flying whale. He had a huge body. Even though he was moving stealthily in the deep ocean, he still created countless waves, attracting the attention of many people. The flying whale traveled faster in the deep ocean than in the sky. It didn't take long for it to arrive 30 miles away from Xiaoming Island. Ahead of it was the hard and huge ice. Along with a deep and loud screech, the flying whale leapt up from the ocean, heading towards Xiaoming Island along with a great amount of seawater. Judging from its determined attitude, it seemed that it intended to crush the entire Xiaoming Island with its huge body. Is it trying to prove the innocence of the Western Sea Sword School with its death? The cultivators of the sects such as Zhongzhou School, Yamatai, and Guoqing Temple naturally wouldn't stop it. They just watched from the sky. But the Aoyama sect wouldn't accept such a development. If the Western Sea Sword School really killed Taiping Jinren, how could the Aoyama sect continue to conquer the West Ocean? More importantly, Taiping Jinren was the former sect master of the Aoyama sect, a figure at the level of the founding master. How could they allow the bastard of the Western Sea Sword School to kill him? A cold, furious, and bloodthirsty roar came from the sword boat of the Aoyama sect. "How dare you, bastard!" The roar echoed between heaven and earth, stirring up countless gusts of wind. The momentum was extremely shocking. The cultivators of various sects were shocked, wondering which peak master of the Aoyama sect was this. Bu Qiuxiao and the others still remembered the Battle of the Cloud platform years ago, when the flying whale was stomped into the sea by Yuan Qijing. They wondered if it was this swordsman. As they were thinking about this, a strange bird suddenly appeared in the sky, its long tail glinting under the sunlight. The strange bird flew to the front of the flying whale at an unimaginable speed and cursed, "Do you want to die?" The cultivators of various sects were stunned, and it was not until now that they realized it was the bird that had spoken. Compared to the huge body of the flying whale, the strange bird was like a small black dot, but the gusts of wind that came with it were extremely terrifying. Countless huge waves rolled up from the sea, slapping on the ice layer around Xiaoming Island. A few cracks appeared on the ice layer. The strange bird's tail was extremely long, like a sword, emitting countless sharp glints. Countless deep wounds appeared on the surface of the flying whale's body, and blood gushed out like a waterfall. The strange bird laughed contentedly and flew back to the sword boat of the Aoyama sect. The flying whale dove toward the surface of the ocean after letting out a deep and painful cry, and dived into the bottom of the ocean, not daring to stick its head out again. A cultivation practitioner asked in surprise, "What is this strange bird?" Hiwei glanced at the cold signal bird beneath him, who was trembling sensei and itching to turn around and flee. He was so annoyed that he didn't want to answer this question. Wu Xiao said, "This is the principal guard of the Aoyama sect, the Dark Phoenix." Upon hearing this answer, the cultivation practitioners of various sects felt their scalps numb, and they were shocked again by the prowess of the Aoyama sect. This principal guard of Aoyama sect, who looked like a rooster with a long tail, used his tail as a sword. It seemed that he was an important figure who had been immersed in the sword work for many years. The immortal Lu Si hadn't wielded his sword yet, and Yuan Qijing hadn't even shown up yet. Together with this master Dark Phoenix, the godly swordsman of West Ocean couldn't do anything to them no matter how powerful he was. As the strong wind blew over, the sword boat of the Aoyama sect swayed slightly. The Dark Phoenix landed on the deck and walked toward the cabin while lifting his head proudly. His tail had been dyed red by the whale's blood, dripping onto the deck. Seeing this, the disciples of the Shangda Peak felt both proud and fearful at the same time. Qian, Duan Lintian, and a few other elders remained silent, not daring to say a word because they had heard some stories about the internal strife of the Aoyama sect and knew that the Master Dark Phoenix and the Master Dead Dog had killed many swordsmen of the Aoyama sect. Young Sister Yushan was the only one who exclaimed while clenching her small fists, "The Master Dark Phoenix is so handsome." The Dark Phoenix nodded slightly to show his appreciation and then walked into the cabin. Yuan Qijing sat in the cabin cross-legged, meditating with his eyes closed. He suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the bloodstains on the tail of the Dark Phoenix. On the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school. Thinking of the earlier scene, Bai Junren asked earnestly, "Is it possible for the two parties to reach an agreement?" "It's impossible," said Bai Junren. "It's because the Aoyama sect has sacrificed too much. The flying swords, magic pills, crystals, and the 17 sword boats have all consumed a great deal of resources. Even if the Cloud Dream Mountain were to prepare for such a war, it would take them decades to accumulate the resources. The conditions set by the Aoyama sect must be extremely harsh, and it's impossible for Jian Shilai to agree." It was then that the peaceful voice of the immortal Lu Si spread over the whole of the West Ocean and was heard by every cultivation practitioner. "Our condition is that the Western Sea Sword School is disbanded, and this place will be managed by the Orthodox sections. But you have to leave and swear by the name of the sword ghost that you'll never come back to Chaotian. Otherwise, you'll be killed by the heavenly thunder." The godly swordsman of West Ocean couldn't accept such a condition, so he didn't say anything. He looked in the direction of Xiaoming Island and the large boat that was intermittently visible amid the clouds and fog, remaining silent for a moment. Su Zai had persuaded the Zhongzhou school to cooperate with the West Ocean to do something, but the Zhongzhou school had remained quiet that day. He was fully aware of the reason. If the West Ocean didn't show its true strength and let the world see the hope of defeating the Aoyama sect, the Immortals Tan and Bai wouldn't show up. The godly swordsman of West Ocean pulled back his gaze and looked at Lu Si expressionlessly. "I came from the ocean." His voice also spread over the whole of the West Ocean. This was the ocean, What he referred to was not this patch of ocean. The godly swordsman of West Ocean continued. I grew up in that patch of fog and learned the sword style. I didn't believe that the sword came from Aoyama since the very first day. There was an uproar among the cultivation practitioners of various sections. The expression on Bu Qiuxiao's face grew grave. The godly swordsman of West Ocean admitted his origin. He was the disciple of the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island in the South Ocean. This was something that the cultivation circle in Chaotian had guessed for a long time, and it had finally been confirmed that day. Many people are here today. It's good. The indifferent gaze of the godly swordsman of West Ocean swept over those boats in the sky. The world will finally know who is the strongest swordsman in the sword work between your Aoyama sect and our Foggy Island. Having said that, he opened his right hand slowly. The sword of 12-story building came back from the distance and landed in his hand. He said to Lu Ci, "Please." The ruined temple on the barren mountain had already collapsed. The skinny and short old man stood in the ruins, looking at Nan Wang in silence. The white cat crouched on Jing Jio's shoulder. His long hair had been tamed, and his tail drooped. He didn't look as formidable as before. Jing Jio gazed over the top of Nan Wang's head and fixed on the old man. He had ascertained something. Nan Shu didn't cultivate himself into a sword ghost. Instead, he chose a path that was the opposite of Jing Jio's. He cultivated himself into a sword and then raised a ghost. The spiritual soul of the cultivation practitioners was nurtured together with the flying sword and the sword pill until the spiritual will was born, which was the sword ghost. The sword ghost was very weak. It was only after the cultivation practitioners broke through the heavenly arrival state that they would be able to drift in the wind, indestructible and extremely powerful, almost like the born shapeless sword body. However, if the cultivation practitioners let the sword ghost fly far away, they wouldn't be able to control the sword themselves, and they would be killed easily. As such, neither the deceased Pei Baifa nor Jian Shilai would choose to fight in such a way. Yet, Nan Shu had cultivated himself into a sword, so he didn't have to worry about this problem. The sword ghost could kill people, and so could the sword. The sword ghost would not perish before the sword was destroyed. This was truly an unimaginable idea. It was an earth-shattering move. Without the first child sword, Nan Shu had pondered hard on the Foggy Island for hundreds of years, and he had cultivated a completely different sword work, which was extremely formidable. Back when they were on the top of the Shima Peak, Jing Jio had told Zhao Liu that the most difficult thing in cultivation was to find a new path. This was the true meaning of founding a new sect. Jing Jio felt a bit of admiration, thinking that the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island was indeed the most outstanding figure in the last 1,000 years. He and his big brother were the same. Thinking of all this, Jing Jio stopped Nan Wang from continuing the fight. He walked to the front of Nan Shu and reached out his right hand. As far as Nan Shu was concerned, Jing Jio's current cultivation state was so low that it was not worth mentioning. As such, Jing Jio didn't even glance at him. It wasn't until this moment. Nan Shu's gaze fell on Jing Jio's face for a long time. It was quiet in the ruined temple on the barren mountain. Nan Shu said while looking at Jing Jio's face, "It's a perfect sword. I feel like I have seen it before." Jing Jio looked at him in silence, saying nothing, his right hand still reaching out. In the old version of Su Ke's novel on Mount Shu, Zhang Xiaoqiu returned to the mountain after joining the devil. He sighed sentimentally when he saw the sword. "It's a righteous sword. I feel like I have seen it before." Chapter 504. The sword boat retreated slowly, and Lu Ci walked into the sky. He stood in the air, looking at the godly swordsman of West Ocean in silence. He didn't speak, but everybody knew that he had accepted the challenge. Seeing him still with his hands folded behind his back, the cultivation practitioners couldn't help but feel startled, wondering where the inherited heaven sword was. Even though the swordsmen in the heavenly arrival state could summon their flying swords in a flash, they still needed some time. In a fight of such a high level, Shouldn't he try his best to summon his flying swords in advance? The ocean wind blew over in the sky between Lu Ci and the godly swordsman of West Ocean, rolling up the tiny waves of a few miles long. The beautiful sunlight was refracted at the moment, looking much sharper. Many cultivation practitioners suddenly felt a stinging pain in their eyes, and tears streamed down reflexively. The sword wills exuded by the two figures were so formidable that they couldn't be looked at directly. As far as the Aoyama sect was concerned, this fight between the two powerful swordsmen was not worth it. However, Lu Ci was the sect master of Aoyama, and Jian Shilai drew his sword, so he had to fight back. Two extremely powerful energies had locked onto each other in the air, and the two of them could strike at any moment. His opponent was also the strongest swordsman in Chaotian. Lu Ci couldn't afford to think about other things at the moment, like the fact that he didn't have a sword or the whereabouts of Nanchu. Even if Nanchu suddenly appeared as Jing Jiao had predicted, Lu Ci had no choice but to ignore him for the time being. Aoyama was here. What could Nanchu do even if he showed up? If Nanchu wanted to take the opportunity to sneak attack Aoyama, he would have a surprise waiting for him. On the frozen surface of the ocean, Xiaoming Island looked like a black jewel amid the snow and frost. The top part of the island had been leveled by the godly swordsmen of West Ocean, and it was extremely smooth, reflecting the sunlight into a more beautiful color. If one observed it carefully, one could even see some underground tunnels. The sword boat on Shangda Peak looked down at the scene from a high spot in the sky. Not far away were the cloud boat of Zhongzhou School and the boat of diligent study of Yamatai. The scripts reciting by the script preachers of the Guocheng Temple could be vaguely heard in the clouds. No matter how powerful Taiping Jinren was, there was no way he could escape from such a situation. Looking at the bloodstains on the Dark Phoenix's tail, Yuan Qijing was not worried that the Dark Phoenix would dare to go against the will of the Life Board and sneak into Xiaoming Island to help his master. It was because he sensed something else. There was a tiny bubble in the bloodstain, and there was a tiny black dot in the bubble. In front of the dilapidated temple in the distant barren mountain, when the red lantern was burned, the small blood bubble also burst. The small black that in the blood bubble floated into the air, expanded with the wind, and quickly turned into a child. The child was wearing a dark-colored shirt and had his hair combed into a small bun. His face was as pale as a ghost, and his body was as thin as a ghost. What the hell? Yuan Qijing's white hair fluttered in the wind, making him look somewhat weathered. His expression was still wooden, but his voice was somewhat rueful. Nanshu's sword ghost had suddenly appeared on the sword boat of Aoyama. Everything happened too suddenly. The Dark Phoenix didn't even have time to react. Crack! The child of the sword ghost passed through Yuan Qijing's body and flew out of the cabin. It wasn't until then that the 3-foot sword on the icy surface broke through the air and returned to the cabin. It turned out that the child of Nanshu's sword ghost had been hiding inside the body of the flying whale. The flying whale pretended to crash into Xiaoming Island and perish together with Taiping Jinren, but he was intercepted by the Dark Phoenix. The child of the sword ghost followed the blood of the flying whale and landed on the tail of the Dark Phoenix. By doing so, he evaded the sword formation of the disciples of Aoyama and entered the sword boat, shortening the distance between him and Yuan Qijing. More importantly, Yuan Qijing's 3-foot sword had been floating on the surface of the ocean the entire time, keeping Xiaoming Island sealed in ice. All this sounded simple enough, but it was necessary to know the true relationship between the Dark Phoenix and Taiping Jinren and to understand Yuan Qijing's true thoughts about Taiping Jinren. It could be said that this was one of the most successful sneak attacks in the history of the cultivation world. The 3-foot sword returned. Yuan Qijing's body was soon covered by a thick layer of ice and snow. No wound could be seen on his body, but judging from his feeble energy, he should have been severely wounded. The child of the sword ghost, who came to the outside of the cabin, looked much fainter now. Young Sister Yushan was the first to discover this eerie thing, and she screamed in alarm. The disciples of Aoyama didn't panic in the face of danger. They reacted quickly, and countless sword lights struck down. In an instant, The temperature of the sword boat dropped a great deal, and a thin layer of frost appeared on the deck. The child of the sword ghost drifted amid the frost and snow, and it seemed that he was traveling even faster than those sword lights. Duan Liantien fell heavily on the ground, no longer breathing. A large hole appeared on his chest, and the sword pill had been sliced into pieces. The flying sword drifted obliquely toward the surface of the ocean without a master. The dark phoenix leapt out of the cabin and let out a furious shriek. The black feather flew toward the child of the sword ghost like a sword. However, the movement of the child of the sword ghost was rather eerie, as if he was not a real shadow. As he dodged the attack of the dark phoenix, he continued his slaughter. With a grunt, Qi Yin retreated with a broken arm. A ghostly shadow drifted around. The child of the sword ghost had completely surpassed the understanding of the sword work. He retreated 100 feet abruptly and arrived at a spot on the sword boat while brushing against the wing of the dark phoenix. Protect young sister. The disciples of the Shangda Peak gathered together and struck down with their flying swords. Blood splashed everywhere, and some disciples died one after another. The wind and snow in the sky suddenly grew wilder and wilder. The child of the sword ghost slowed down a bit. In the next moment, he sneaked into the inside of the sword boat, much to everyone's surprise. The people guessed what this monster intended to do, but it was too late to stop him. Along with a loud cracking sound, the core of the sword boat was destroyed. It fell down from the sky and fell to the ground. It couldn't bear such a heavy weight anymore, breaking into countless pieces. The disciples of the Shangda Peak leapt up on their swords in tandem. Some of the disciples who were wounded or killed fell down along with the broken pieces of the sword boat. The dark phoenix flew up into the sky while shrieking shrilly, chasing after the small and faintly discernible shadow in the sky. As the sword lights flashed, the disciples of the other sword boats of Aoyama came to the rescue, but 3 of them were killed by the child of the sword ghost in an instant. The wind and snow grew fiercer, and a transparent ice ball suddenly appeared in the sky. The child of the sword ghost was trapped in the ice ball. It didn't take long for the ice ball to break apart after countless cracks appeared on it. Yuan Qijing stood in the wind and snow, staring at a spot in the sky, his long hair hanging loosely over his shoulders. He wielded the 3-foot sword with both of his hands toward that spot. The wind and snow enshrouded the West Ocean. The figure of the child of the sword ghost was intermittently visible in the midst of the wind and snow. Without any order, all the flying swords of the sword boats of Aoyama flew in that direction. Hundreds of flying swords with hundreds of formidable sword lights pierced through the wind and snow, chasing after that figure. Such a force could kill even the strongest demon general and the devil man of the underworld. Yet, Lu Ci knew that it was not enough. It was because his opponent was the most powerful sword fairy in the world, and he was obviously in a very peculiar state. Looking at the figure in the wind and snow, Lu Ci raised his thin eyebrows and was about to strike out with his sword. All of a sudden, countless tides appeared at the West Ocean. The sword of the 12-story building arrived. It was a loud bang. The tides dispersed, and the ocean wind stirred up the wind and snow. The cultivation practitioners of various sects looked up at the sky and saw 2 tall figures fighting in the empty realm in a high altitude. The thunder and lightning kept striking down. In the ruined temple on the barren mountain, looking at Nan Shu, Jing Jiao took a step forward and grabbed Nan Shu's hand with his right hand. Nan Shu's hand was old and cold, full of wrinkles. It didn't look like a hand, but more like a lifeless object. Innumerable sword lights shot out from their clasped hands, drifting in all directions. The hidden wound in Nan Wang's body was triggered by the sword wills and acted up again. He pressed his head against Jing Jiao's back, his face pale. Crouching on Jing Jiao's shoulder, the white cat stared into Nan Shu's eyes, pondering the best time to strike. He could be a coward at any other time, but today was a matter that concerned the survival of the Aoyama sect. As the principal Gar of Aoyama, he couldn't afford to back off. The sword lights kept on drifting out from the tightly clasped hands of Jing Jiao and Nan Shu, like the snowflakes, and then dropped down slowly into the ruins from the sky. Clang! Countless sword sounds broke out. The ruins of the ruined temple, and the pebbles were cut into the tiniest particles, which were swirled up by the wind. The wind was soon cut into pieces and turned into the mildest spring breeze, which landed on Jing Jiao's face. His countenance didn't change at all. Nan Shu remarked sentimentally while looking at Jing Jiao, "It's indeed a perfect sword, but it's a pity that your cultivation state is still too low." It was the principle that the sword rose up with the user. Jing Jiao said, "You're a sword right now. You don't even have a cultivation state." What he meant was the principle of nurturing a sword ghost and seizing one's soul. "I didn't expect you to know this," Nan Shu remarked, feeling a bit surprised. Jing Jiao said, "Your Tao tree was cut down back then, and you embarked on the path of cultivating the sword in reverse. Your body is indeed indestructible." "Yes," said Nan Shu. "It's hard for anything to hurt me now. I'm very special," said Jing Jiao. It was true that even Nan Wang in the upper state of the Broken Sea couldn't hurt Nan Shu, but Jing Jiao could. A tiny cut appeared on Nan Shu's wrist. Soon after, a cut appeared on the web between his thumb and forefinger, for which the blood and flesh could be seen. The eerie part was that the blood and flesh were grayish-white, looking like a dried corpse. "Everything is real without a cultivation state," Nan Shu went on while staring at Jing Jiao. "Your problem is that you've tried to cultivate the sword to a cultivation state. When your cultivation state is low, your sword won't be so special." No sooner had he said this than a section of Jing Jiao's cloth fell off. Soon after, a section of his hair fell off as well. In the next moment, a section of his earlobe fell off. Seeing the drop of blood on Jing Jiao's ear, the white cat was stunned speechless, wondering why Jing Jiao was wounded. Nan Shu said to him with a faint smile, "You'll die if you don't let go of your hand. Are you afraid of that?" The sword sound was still echoing in heaven and earth. It sounded a bit distorted, like a buzzing sound. The sword lights were drifting around randomly, cutting everything that they could encounter. Jing Jiao told Lu Shui in the village that he was good at cutting things off. Today, he had finally met another person who was as good at cutting things off as he was. The difference was that one used a person as a sword, and the other used a sword as a person. As Nan Shu said, his cultivation state was still too low. If he didn't let go of his hand, he would die for sure. Jing Jiao didn't want to die, but he wouldn't let go of his hand either. He said to Nan Shu, "The sword formation of Aoyama is coming. Are you afraid of that?" End of this chapter. Chapter 505. Holding the white cat in his arms, Jing Jiao followed Nan Wang out of Aoyama. It took them one summer to find this ruined temple on the barren mountain. Seeing the red lanterns outside the ruined temple and the black coffin inside, Jing Jiao made up his mind a few moments later. He used the thoughtless sword to send a letter to Aoyama, informing Lu Xi of his plan. According to Jing Jiao's calculation, Nan Shu's sword ghost would either go to Aoyama or the West Ocean. Either way, the Aoyama sect had to deal with it with all their strength. As for the dried corpse in the black coffin, Jing Jiao and Nan Wang would deal with it. It happened that the two of them were the most suitable candidates to deal with this problem. Unexpectedly, Nan Shu had cultivated the way of the sword ghost and had turned his own body into a sword, which posed a new problem for him. Jing Jiao knew better than anybody else how formidable a sword ghost with an independent spiritual soul was. In Nan Shu's cultivation state, his sword ghost was equivalent to the upper limit of the underworld fairy sword. Jing Jiao had no choice but to walk into the ruined temple and hold Nan Shu's aged hand. He didn't employ the locking the autumn in the sword style of Aoyama, because it was too low a cultivation state to trap Nan Shu. And he didn't employ the freezing of all in the sword jail, because his cultivation state was not high enough to employ it. What he employed was the benevolent hand of the Zen sections. As long as he could trap Nan Shu here, he could summon the sword formation of Aoyama to destroy his body, and his sword ghost would perish along with it. Even if Nan Chu's sword ghost had a way to protect himself, it would be greatly affected, and he wouldn't be able to pose any threat to Aoyama. As soon as Jingjiu had said that, a gust of wind suddenly rose up on the barren mountain, passing through the ruins of the ruined temple and making a whistling sound, which sounded like a ghost crying or a sword whistling. In the distant Aoyama, the clouds and fog on the sword peak had dispersed a long time ago. The bright sunlight became exceedingly bright, and it was impossible to look at it directly. Standing on the top of Tianguang Peak, Fang Jingtian looked in the direction of the West Ocean with a grave expression on his face, looking a bit lonely. The sword formation of Aoyama had been activated. Who was its target? Master will be fine, right? The whole of Aoyama was empty. Even the stewards had gone to the outer sect. The ice and snow on the Shangda Peak sensed the extremely sharp sword intent, which seemed to be able to pierce through the sky, and fell with rustling sounds. The feeling was the most obvious in the sword jail. Countless sword wills gushed out from the stone walls and the formations, flying everywhere like tangible flying swords. The mountain-like dead dog sat under the sunlight in silence. Even he had to squint his eyes, otherwise he would feel uncomfortable. The fiendish demons in the cells were even more terrified. They no longer dared to release the mountainous and ocean-like stench of blood. Hiding in a corner, Sensei trembled. The old and cruel voice of Martial Uncle Tai Lu came from one of the cells. Kill them all. Let them witness the power of Aoyama. In the deepest cell, Yuki Jie was wrapped in a quilt and squatting on a bamboo chair. She wondered if this was the legendary Aoyama sword array. Interesting indeed. The great grandmaster of the Foggy Island was the first hidden swordsman. It could be said that he was the founder of this strange story in the cultivation world, and he was also the proof of the power of the sword formation of Aoyama. He was well aware of the power of the sword formation of Aoyama. Otherwise, how could a powerful figure like him be forced to hide in that patch of damp and cold fog for so many years? Hearing what Jingjiu said, his reaction was a bit strange. He didn't feel angry or fearful. Instead, he laughed out loud. His smile was a bit complicated, but it turned into an indescribable relief in the end, as if he had found a release. I've avoided it for 1,000 years, living a life worse than death. But I've returned to the land now. It's because my life has come to an end, and my time is up. Nan Chu asked Jingjiu, if so, why should I be afraid of it? This was a good question. Jingjiu said, no matter how close death is, it's not the real fear until it arrives. But I'm still alive even if I'm dead, Nan Chu said. This conversation was rather peculiar. Nan Wang and the white cat couldn't understand it. Jingjiu was certain that he had miscalculated. Nan Chu came here to meet his death. For such a person, there was nothing that could make him feel afraid. All he needed to do was to accomplish what he wanted to do before his death arrived. As far as Aoyama was concerned, Nan Chu should die sooner. Let's do it, Jingjiu said without hesitation. No sooner had he said this than the sword of the universe dropped down from the sky, thrusting toward Nan Chu's head. Nan Wang darted out from behind Jingjiu, thrusting the zither sword toward Nan Chu's left eye while holding it with both hands. Jingjiu's mouth moved slightly, but the white cat had made his move before he could utter the word move. Crouching on Jingjiu's shoulder, the cat raised his right paw and aimed at Nan Chu's right eye as fast as lightning. The West Ocean. Hundreds of flying swords hacked at the wind and snow. No matter how unpredictable the child of the sword ghost was, he was still hit by a few of the swords. Yet, it was baffling that the child of the sword ghost didn't seem to be wounded at all, except for a dozen white lines in his body. What kind of monster was he? They couldn't kill him no matter how hard they tried. Yuan Qijing was wounded by the sneak attack, and his sword source was not in control. The wind and snow unleashed by the 3-foot sword could only slow down the body of the child of the sword ghost a little bit, but it couldn't stop him. The dark phoenix chased after him furiously. His tail feathers drifted down, indicating that he was wounded as well. The Dark Phoenix was the fastest swordsman in Aoyama. Even though he exerted all his strength to outrun the flying swords, he still couldn't catch up with the child of the sword ghost. He looked like a pitiful child chasing after the setting sun. The sword ghost in the upper limit of the heavenly arrival state could be considered a ferryman on the verge of becoming one. It was truly dreadful. In the blink of an eye, another sword boat of Aoyama had been destroyed. The disciples of Aoyama were riding their swords to evade it or falling into the ocean. The cultivation practitioners of Ozawa and the Platonist sect couldn't stand by and watch any longer. They all went to rescue their swords. On the cloud boat of Zhongzhou School, Baijunren glanced at Baizeo and said calmly, "Aoyama doesn't stop here." On the boat in Yamatsai, Buqiuxiao glanced at Lu Shisui and said, "The resources of Aoyama are still there. Don't worry." The Dragontail Inkstone was hidden in the void, ready to be used at any time. Even though the war between Aoyama and the West Ocean was getting more and more intense, he was still concerned about Taiping Jinren. Suddenly, a voice came from the largest sword boat in Aoyama. "Shuriwe, fight! Awesome! Void! Room!" Donyo, Sushur, and Shurshur were all star positions. The sword boats of Aoyama in the distance were probably the disciples of Shuriwe Peak. Upon hearing the order, they sent out their flying swords, heading toward the star positions in the sky. Then, the voice shouted without a pause, "Shall I? Kue Lu Zhang Yi." Another 100 sword lights came from a sword boat in Aoyama and landed in a certain spot in the sky. Qingguang, Taiwei City, Liangwang, Jiaokong, Sanheng, Bihu, Yugui, 5 stars. The voice was usually lazy and listless, but it was unprecedentedly solemn and earnest that day, and it spoke very quickly. Along with this voice, countless flying swords stopped pursuing the child of the sword ghost. They landed in a certain spot in the sky as instructed, forming a messy scene. No pattern or structure could be seen in the scene, but it gave off a solemn and eternal sense of beauty, like the starry sky and the night sky. The Aoyama sect cultivated not only the sword work, but also the formations. Their formations were the inherited heaven sword style. The most powerful sword formation of Aoyama, and the 2 sword formations that had appeared that day, were all based on the inherited heaven sword style. Nanchu sensed the sword wills in heaven and earth, which made it more difficult for his sword ghost to teleport. Looking at the sword boat in Aoyama ahead, a grave expression showing on his pale face. Who could set up the corresponding formation so quickly and clearly under such a complicated situation? The person who presided over the formation was neither the injured Yuan Qijing nor Guangyuan Jinren. It was a young disciple. In this spectacular battle that day, no matter how talented Zhurizhui was, he could only play an insignificant role. He wielded his sword while sitting on the deck, and then felt sleepy. He didn't stand up until the situation had suddenly changed. He started to set up the formation after observing for a period of 13 breaths. He was the personal disciple of Lu Ci. He had stayed behind closed doors since he entered the sect, and had only learned the inherited heaven sword style over the last few decades. Though his current cultivation state was not high enough, his understanding of the formations of Aoyama and his innate sensitivity were unparalleled. Even in Mo Chi and Bai Rujing, the 2 elders of Tingguang Peak, were not as good as him in this aspect, to say nothing of Guanan Shan and his colleagues. Even Jing Jiu admitted that Zhuo Rizhui's inherited heaven sword was better than Gu Qing's, and also better than his. The flying swords of the Aoyama sect stopped chasing after the child of the sword ghost, and returned to their respective positions. All the swords, regardless of whether they were in the upper limit of the broken sea state, the new disciples who had just come down from the sword peak, the bright red thoughtless sword, or the ordinary green steel sword, were playing their roles in their respective positions. The hundreds of flying swords were like hundreds of stars, but also like hundreds of flowers. They were placed randomly and pierced through the sky. The child of the sword ghost was in the midst of the chaotic flowers in the starry sky, so he couldn't travel through them easily. Looking at the young disciple of Aoyama on the sword boat with drooping eyes, he he suddenly disappeared and reappeared on the sword boat in an instant. This sword formation was not perfect yet, so there was still a chance for him to take advantage of it. He intended to seize the opportunity to kill the person who had set up the formation. There was a loud, buzzing sound. Yuan Qijing walked out from behind Ruzhui, holding an ice mirror in his right hand to block the child of the sword ghost. The ice mirror shattered, and Yuan Qijing spat out a mouthful of blood essence. Ruzhui's face was a bit pale. The sword formation of 6 peaks he had set up needed the sword master of the 6 peaks to be the leader of the formation. Now he only had the sword master of the 5 peaks, which was still not enough. The sword formation was not perfect yet, so it couldn't stop the horrible child of the sword ghost from killing more people. It was at this moment that a flash of silver light pierced through the sky from a distance and landed somewhere in the sword formation. The entire sword formation became complete instantly, and the child of the sword ghost was blocked outside. It was a small sword about 3 feet long, its blade extremely smooth and bright like a mirror. Seeing this sword, many elders of Aoyama were shocked, especially Guananshan and other disciples of Liangwang Peak, who were shocked speechless. The sword master of Liangwang Peak. Didn't the lone sword ascend with martial granduncle Jingyang? Why was it still in the human world? On the boat of diligent study in Yamatsai, Bu Qiuxiao shot a meaningful glance at Lu Shui, saying nothing. Lu Shui pulled back his hand and said while looking at the sky, "It thunders. Is it going to rain?" Innumerable thunder boomed in the high sky. The wind and snow in heaven and earth were affected by the thunder, gradually melting and falling down as raindrops. Lu Xi and the godly swordsmen of West Ocean returned to the surface of the ocean. Their clothes were all wet, but it was hard to tell if they were wounded or not. Hundreds of swords of Aoyama formed a sword formation and surrounded the sword boat, looking like the raindrops in the sky. It was a marvelous scene. Their opponent was only one person. The child of the sword ghost was drifting in the sky, expressionless. His entire body exuded formidable sword wills, giving off an exceedingly formidable feeling. Countless gazes were fixed on the child of the sword ghost, feeling astonished. Who was this strange person? He had destroyed 2 sword boats of Aoyama, killed so many disciples of Aoyama, and wounded Yuan Qijing severely in an instant. The powerful and invincible Aoyama sect seemed to be defenseless in front of this person. The godly swordsmen of West Ocean came to the back of the child of the sword ghost and bowed to him. What he did was the bow of a disciple. Seeing this, Bu Qiuxiao and the others were certain of their conjecture, their faces looking even more terrible. The news had spread out gradually. The cultivation practitioners of various sects had learned that this child of the sword ghost was the great grandmaster of the foggy island, Nanshu. The ocean waves were rising and falling slightly, like the emotions of the people at the moment. The silence was full of astonishment. The great grandmaster of the foggy island, Nanshu, was an unparalleled swordsman back then. He had stopped the ascension of the great grandmaster of Aoyama and was like a fairy swordsman. It was because of this event that he became the first hidden swordsman. He had been forced to stay on the foggy island by the sword formation of Aoyama for almost 1,000 years. He was still alive. How could he dare leave the foggy island? More shockingly, this person looked even more formidable, even though he had changed into the appearance of a little child. Even the Aoyama sect couldn't stop him. Was it because he had finally broken through again after hiding on the foggy island for so many years and entered the state of heavenly arrival? So he was no longer afraid of the sword formation of Aoyama? Looking at Yuan Qijing, who was covered in frost and had a slightly chaotic energy, Nanshu remarked expressionlessly, "You're too weak. That's why you can't become the sect master." Then he turned to Lu Xi and said, "You're too slow. You can't do it either." The 2 most powerful figures in the heavenly arrival state of the Aoyama sect were not worth mentioning in a few simple words. It was extremely domineering. If Nanshu had become the personal disciple of the immortal Daoyuan, he would have been the grandmaster of Lu Xi and Yuan Qijing. It was then that the voice of Joie Rujui broke out again. He was not setting up the formation this time, and his voice was not as solemn and earnest as before. It was as lazy as usual. You can't even break through my formation. What are you boasting about, little old man? Nanchu narrowed his eyes slightly, looking at Joie Rujui as if he was looking at a dead man. Let me introduce him. He is my personal disciple, Lu Ci added, and you should be aware that you're going to die soon. Sensing the energy of the sword formation of Aoyama, Nanchu said, I didn't expect you people to find me, but so what? Lu Ci understood what he meant, saying, I'll kill you first then. End of this chapter. Chapter 506. I'll say it again. You can't do it. Nanchu looked like a little child at the moment. He looked a bit adorable when he wagged his finger, but the eerie smile on his pale face made him look rather dreadful. However, it's said that you're the strongest swordsman in Chaotian. I'll give you a chance to challenge me. I'll say it again. You'll die. Lu Ci went on with a faint smile. I'm the sect master of Aoyama, so I'm invincible. Nanchu couldn't help but laugh. How can you kill me when your grandmaster, master, and senior masters couldn't even do it? I'll kill you with my sword, of course, said Lu Ci. But you don't even have a sword, said Nanchu sympathetically while looking at him. Upon hearing this, the cultivation practitioners of various sects burst into an uproar. It wasn't until that day that the cultivation practitioners of Chaotian learned about it. The swords came out of Aoyama, and the immortal Lu Ci, as the sect master of Aoyama, didn't have a sword of his own. It was true that Lu Ci had no choice but to lack a sword. Back when he returned to Aoyama from the Zhongzhou school, he had no choice but to travel slowly in the sky by stepping on the sword cloud. This was also the reason why he didn't have a sword. The following fight is not a true contest. It's my instruction to you. Looking at Lu Ci, Nanchu said with a warm expression in his eyes, How can you achieve the path without a sword? I'm the only one who can solve this problem. Be my disciple, and I'll spare your life. To be able to instruct the sect master of Aoyama on the sword work was a perfect scene for Nanchu, who was determined to surpass the Aoyama sect for the rest of his life. Nanchu was fully aware that Lu Ci wouldn't agree to this request, but he would teach him in a more direct way. At the same time, he would let all the cultivation practitioners in the world know who was the #1 swordsman. Lu Ci had already walked out of the sword formation of 6 stars and arrived in the sky. Nanchu's figure disappeared abruptly. In the next moment, he arrived in front of Lu Ci along with countless sword lights. He didn't wield his sword, because the child of the sword ghost was a sword himself. Lu Ci did not draw his sword, because he did not have a sword. He stretched out his broad palm, bringing with it the countless sword wills of the world, which formed a square diagram. Whoosh! The hundreds of Aoyama flying swords that hovered in the sky like raindrops began to tremble, while the real raindrops instantly turned into powder and disappeared without a trace. Nanchu was drifting gently in the sky. It was hard to tell if his figure was real or fake. He looked like both a ghost and a ferryman. Suddenly, a splash appeared on the surface of the sea. Lu Ci rose up on his sword cloud and floated toward the sky again. His whole body was drenched, and his clothes were torn all over. Faint traces of blood could be seen. The sect master of Aoyama was considered the strongest swordsman in all of Chaotian, but he was slashed so badly by a swing of the sword. Seeing this, all the cultivators were shocked speechless. In the beginning, some people thought that Nanchu's sword ghost method was formidable, and that he might not be able to defeat the immortal Lu Ci. But they had finally realized that the great Grandmaster of the Foggy Island was indeed the great Grandmaster of the Foggy Island. Seeing Lu Ci fly back from the surface of the sea, Nanchu's expression was full of complicated emotions. It was the happiness of having his wish fulfilled, but it was also the emptiness of being invincible. Back then, Daiyuan thought I had a murderous nature, so he didn't want to take me as his disciple. I wasn't convinced, so I found a manor house left by the ferryman of the previous generation overseas and developed a new idea. In the end, I had surpassed him in the sword work. He thought that he could use the sword formation of Aoyama to cut down my Dao tree and seize my first child sword in order to destroy my sword work. But is it possible? Nan Chu went on sentimentally. I've cultivated diligently on the foggy island for hundreds of years, and I've finally mastered the most perfect sword work. By using the sword ghost as a human and the human as a sword, I've become invincible in the world. Lu Ci said after wiping off the blood on his beard with his sleeve. Sneak attacking and surpassing are two different concepts. Upon hearing this, Nan Chu grew angry and said sternly, "No matter what, I've won. I've proven that my sword work is far superior to your Aoyama's sword work." 1,000 years ago, that youth from the south wanted to become the personal disciple of the sect master of Aoyama, the immortal Dao Yuan, but he was refused. What he wanted to do most in his long cultivation life was to destroy Aoyama, to prove to everybody, including the deceased immortal Dao Yuan, that people could still cultivate the ultimate sword work even without Aoyama, and even surpass Aoyama. Back when Shuang's son took Lu Shui as his personal disciple, what the godly swordsman of West Ocean had done over the years was to prove it. In the end, it was that youth who had accomplished his goal. You've been defeated by me today, and Aoyama will keep losing until it's destroyed. I've already seen that day. Nan Chu looked at Lu Ci, his eyes exuding a cold and blazing glow. The downfall of Aoyama will start from now on. Bu Xiaoxiao said that the individual cultivation practitioners were of little significance in the war in the cultivation circle, unless they were figures in the heavenly arrival state. Nan Chu was such a person. The godly swordsman of West Ocean stood in the sky behind Nan Chu like a statue. The prowess of this pair of master and disciple could only be compared to the immortal Jingyang and Taiping Zhenren in the last 1,000 years. If either Lu Ci or Yuan Qijing died at the West Ocean, the Aoyama sect would have no choice but to seal off their mountains like the No Mercy sect had done. As far as the Aoyama sect was concerned, the best solution was for Lu Ci to return to the sword formation of 6 stars and wait for the sword formation of Aoyama to fall and kill Nan Chu. However, doing so would be tantamount to admitting that the sword work of Aoyama was inferior to that of the Foggy Island. The Aoyama sect rarely had the option of admitting defeat, not to mention that their opponent was the Foggy Island that day. Lu Ci said to Nan Chu, "Your proof is not enough." This meant that they would fight again. Nobody thought Lu Ci would win, including his allies like Ozawa and the Platonist sect. The immortal Lu Ci had always been considered the strongest swordsman in Chaotian, but the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island, Nan Chu, was simply too powerful. Cultivation was about the passage of time. Nan Chu had a high generation and a profound cultivation state, and he was the strongest swordsman in the world back then. Now, he had created a new method of sword ghost, and he was a fairy man. The most dreadful part was that Nan Chu came here to seek his own death. When a fairy swordsman decided to risk his life and become a ghost, nobody could defeat him. When he decided to use his own life in exchange for the defeat of the Aoyama sect, nobody could stop him. If Lu Ci were defeated by his sword, what would the Aoyama sect do? Zhao Liu thought that she would stay behind closed doors for 100 years after returning to Aoyama. Lu Shui thought that he had to study hard in Yamatsai and try to break through the heavenly arrival state as soon as possible. Then he would return to Aoyama and rebuild his sect. Zhuo Rizhui thought to himself, "Damn it." As Lu Ci was killing Nan Chu on the ocean, Jingzhou was also killing Nan Chu in the ruined temple on the barren mountain. He grabbed Nan Chu's hand and exerted a bit of force. More sword lights came out from the point of contact between their hands, slicing the broken ruins into smaller particles. The ground of the barren mountain cracked open, and countless deep cracks appeared on the ground, where the underground spring could be vaguely seen. The sky opened up, and the sword of the universe pierced toward Nan Chu's head in a straight line. Huh! Nan Chu reached out his left hand and grabbed the tip of the sword of the universe. The sword of the universe was as clean as a dustless object, but it seemed to be alive at the moment, vibrating incessantly in an attempt to cut off Nan Shu's hand. "It's a good sword," Nan Shu praised. As he uttered these two words, the sharp claws of the white cat had already reached his right eye. Nan Shu closed his eyes and used his eyelids to block this strike. Crack! A withered willow tree on the cliff a few miles away was broken into two halves. An endless energy came out from the skinny old man's body. He lifted up Jing Jio's body and smashed it toward Nan Wang, who had just arrived in front of him. Boom! Nan Wang was knocked backward and smashed into the field a few miles away, sending up a great deal of sand and pebbles. The entrance of a cave could be vaguely seen amid the smoke and dusts. Nan Shu couldn't shake off Jing Jio's hand, so he used Jing Jio as a weapon and slammed Nan Wang into the deep end of the cliff. The white cat let out an eerie and dreadful shriek. He leaped down from Jing Jio's shoulder and grabbed Nan Shu's head, scratching it with all his might. If a regular house cat scratched it, it would at most leave a thin red line on the head. But he was the master white ghost, the principal guard of Aoyama. Each of his claws was as powerful as a sword in the heavenly arrival. The bright lights and the dreadful sword wills were everywhere on the barren mountain. The cliff collapsed, and the smoke and dust rose up. Nan Wang's angry voice rang out outside the smoke and dusts. F***CK, your ancestors. She leaped up while holding the zither sword with both of her hands, and slashed it down toward Nan Shu's head. Nan Shu's countenance was expressionless as he swung Jing Jio at the zither sword. Boom! Nan Wang was sent flying backward again, and half of the stony mountain collapsed from the impact. He couldn't get up from the ground. The white cat was still attacking madly amid the smoke and dusts, looking like a flash of formidable white light. The dreadful meowing could be heard incessantly, as if the cat was calling for sex. Nan Shu grunted and swung Jing Jio at the cat. His attacks were like a rainstorm, and he had swung hundreds of times in a few seconds. With a dreadful meowing, the white cat was hit by Jing Jio and fell into the wild grass. "I didn't expect you, an old devil, to have attained the path toward heaven in the end. Is it possible that the sword work will eventually lead to the unification of sword and human?" Lu Ci's voice rang out in the sky again. There was no fear in his voice, nor was there any coldness before a fight. There was only calmness and confidence in his voice. He said to Nan Shu sympathetically, "It's a pity that you're not the first person to walk on this path." Creating a new sword work was like discovering the principle of heaven and earth. The first person to achieve it was, of course, the most important. The cultivation practitioners of various sects were startled, but they didn't quite believe it. They thought that the immortal Lu Ci intended to disturb the mind of the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island. Though they couldn't understand Nan Shu's sword ghost method, they were fully aware that such a formidable sword work was not a secret method of any sect. Only a talented swordsman like Nan Shu could create such a sword work hundreds of years after his Dao tree was destroyed. His first child sword was stolen, and he was trapped on the Foggy Island. With such a condition, it was impossible to find another person in all of Chaotian, to say nothing of the Aoyama sect. Hearing what Lu Ci said, Nan Shu was startled, but he soon calmed down, saying, "It's impossible. I'm the only one who can create such a brilliant sword work." Back when his Dao tree was destroyed by the immortal Dayuan using the sword work of Aoyama, and his first child sword was stolen, his cultivation state stagnated. As a result, he had no choice but to resort to a risky method. He transformed his body into a sword, and then he used the sword pill to invade his body and gave all of his spiritual soul to the sword ghost. Your sword work is indeed unique. You used the soul-capturing method of the southern barbaric tribes to refine the sword ghost, and then used the dark fire of the Foggy Island to refine your body into a sword. The combination of these two methods is indeed brilliant. Hearing what Lu Ci said, the expression on Nan Shu's face grew more and more unsightly, because it was evident that Lu Ci knew something about his sword work. However, Aoyama has known this method a long time ago. It was quiet at the West Ocean, except for the ripples and Lu Si's voice. There's one more thing I want to clarify. Lu Si went on, in fact, I have a sword. The sheath of the inherited heaven sword appeared in front of him. Nan Shu said with narrowed eyes, this is the sheath of the sword. Everybody could tell that. A sheath is needed only if you have a sword. This is a simple principle. Please, Lu Si said. He looked at Nan Shu. Yet, he said this please to somebody else. He held the sheath of the inherited heaven sword with his left hand and grabbed something in the air with his right hand, pulling it out slowly. No sword came out from nowhere. Yet the whole heaven and earth heard a sword sound. The barren mountain had collapsed, and the ruined temple was gone. The wild grass had turned into frost, and the wild dust had died down. Countless white marks appeared on Nan Shu's face and neck, looking rather dreadful, but he was not severely wounded. In the wild grass, the white cat licked his paw, which was stained red with blood. It was unclear how many of his nails were broken. Jingjiu was in the worst condition. His face was pale, and blood seeped out from every pore on his body, making him look like a bloody man. A great deal of his sword source had been consumed as well. Half of the white cat's teeth were broken, and the blood was dripping down from the corners of his mouth. He didn't bite Nan Shu again, but stared at Jingjiu with a complicated expression in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but everybody could see the imploring intent in his eyes, as if he was begging Jingjiu to agree to something. It was unclear what he wanted Jingjiu to agree to at such a critical moment. Could it be that he could reverse the situation by agreeing to it? Unexpectedly, Jingjiu didn't pay any attention to him. Instead, he posed a few serious questions to Nan Shu. The red lantern has been destroyed, and the sword ghost can't return to this body. Which one of you is the real you? If I kill this you, will the surviving you still be you? Will the other you still be yourself? When they were fighting to the death, it was strange to suddenly discuss such a question. Yet, Nan Shu gave the answer, and it was obvious that he had given it some serious thought. The surviving me is me. Jingjiu fell silent for a while before saying, what you said makes sense. A sword sound could be heard in the distance. It was an invitation. Please come back. If it were before, he wouldn't accept it no matter how many people were killed in front of him. But he changed his mind today. It was because he wanted to compete with Nan Shu to see who was the strongest swordsman in the swordwork. Aoyama was still the foggy island. I'm still you. As such, he accepted Lu Si's invitation. Then, he drifted up. End of this chapter. Chapter 507. The clouds and fog had dispersed, and the sunlight shone on Aoyama. Every peak could be seen clearly. Shangda Peak felt warmer. The dead dog didn't squint his eyes anymore. He lifted his head to look at the sunlight, the expression in his eyes rather warm. In the deep part of the sword jail, Marshal Uncle Tai Lu's shout turned into an almost inaudible murmur. One, is it? Is it one? In the lonely cell, the snow girl squatted on the bamboo chair, sensing the change of energy in heaven and earth. After a moment of silence, she uttered a faint moan. The sunlight on Tianguang Peak was still the brightest, but the hole in the stone monument grew deeper and gloomier. The round turtle under the stone monument opened his eyes slowly. The expression in his eyes was deep and gloomy, very much like that hole. Looking at the hole on the stone monument, Fang Jingtian remarked sentimentally, Master, you're right. On top of the once run-down temple, Jingjiu's feet left the ground, drifting in the air. Back in the fiend prison, he had learned the underworld fairy sword with the help of the king of the underworld. As a result, he became much lighter and cleaner than regular cultivation practitioners. It was because the impure energy in his body had been tempered by the soul fire, so he was drifting in the air. Yet when he drifted in the air, it was different from usual. It felt more like a non-human, like a flag in the wind or a sail on the ocean. It was because he was still holding Nan Shu's hand that his body drifted up horizontally in midair, his right hand aimed at Nan Shu's body. His right hand was wounded severely by monk Duhai in the Guocheng temple. Later, he searched for whetstones all over Chaotian, and it took him 1 year to heal his right hand. His right hand had recovered completely, and it was sharper than before. He was quite familiar with this posture. He had always flown like this, no matter whether he was at the bottom of the coal mountain or when he dug a hole in the ground. It was for the purpose of sharpening his sword and to get used to it in advance. Perhaps he had already anticipated this day at the time. Seeing Jing Jiao drifting in the air, Nan Chu's eyes displayed a strong sense of wariness. Yet it was too late. Before the thought came to his mind, Jing Jiao had already flown away. Whoosh! Jing Jiao disappeared from the original spot, nowhere to be found. Nan Chu lowered his head to look at his own body and found a large hole there. Inside the cave was a stretch of nothingness. Just like the round window in the meditation room of the 3,000 nunnery, one could see spring, summer, autumn, and winter, everything in the world. Nan Chu vaguely understood something. The white cat squatted in the grass and stared at him, its eyes filled with sympathy and cruelty. Nan Wang flew out of the cave and was about to continue fighting when he suddenly realized that his opponent had become like this. He was so stunned that he even forgot to curse. Jing Jiao was flying. He had never flown so fast before, whether it was when he was riding a sword, or when he was using the Netherworld fairy sword, whether it was in his previous life or this life. All the images on the ground turned into lines of various colors that quickly moved backward. He vaguely felt that even the thoughtless sword swimming was not as fast as he was now. This was not an accurate calculation or judgment, because he had already entered a state where he was neither an object nor himself. His Tao heart was clear yet chaotic. Strangely enough, he could see the reality of heaven and earth through those colorful lines in such a state. The green lines should be the green fields, and the red lines should be the walls of the Bao'ong Zen Temple and the hot pot in Izhou City. The occasional white specks might be the Yuanyang hot pot, which was rarely seen in Izhou City. Then he saw a patch of blue. It was blue everywhere. The ocean and the sky were the same color. The West Ocean and the blue sky were the same color. Standing between the sky and the ocean, Lu Xi held the sheath of the inherited heaven sword with his left hand and pulled out the invisible sword with his right hand. After the sword sound rang out, it didn't stop. It gave off a seemingly endless sound of friction. It was unclear whether it was being sheathed or unsheathed. Countless sword wheels in heaven and earth gathered toward him, and his right hand was the center. His figure looked extremely tall in the light, like a god or a giant who intended to slay a god with his sword. Nan Chu's body suddenly grew fainter. The godly swordsman of West Ocean lifted his head abruptly and pointed his finger forward. The sword of the 12-story building was called back. Along with the crisp cracking sounds, it broke into 12 pieces. The broken pieces of sword surrounded Nan Chu's body like a broken pagoda, forming an exceedingly strong barrier. Lu Xi's sword fell down. It was windless in the sky, which looked like a piece of frozen ice. The surface of the ocean was also very calm, like a gloomy ancient mirror. Yet the absolute quietness gave off a strong feeling of being torn apart. It seemed that the sky and the ocean would drift apart. As the sword fell down, heaven and earth seemed to be on the verge of being split apart. Everybody could sense it, but they didn't have enough time to react. In other words, they didn't dare to react. Hundreds of flying swords of Aoyama lowered their heads slightly, indicating their submission. The lone sword was the only exception, as if it wanted to express something. Bai Jinren spun his head abruptly and looked toward the south, a strange expression showing on his face. Bu Xiao sensed the fear from the dragon tail inkstone, raising his eyebrows slightly. What kind of sword was it? As soon as the sword light appeared on the horizon, Nan Chu had made his move. He disappeared from the original spot. 5 puffs of smoke and dust seemed to appear in the blue sky at the same time, and each puff of smoke and dust was a few miles away from each other. In the blink of an eye, he had arrived at a very high place in the sky. Yet, he didn't dare take this sword head-on, fleeing instead. A moment ago, the sword light was still on the horizon. In the next moment, the sword light arrived at the West Ocean. The surface of the ocean was illuminated, as if the morning sun had risen again. The energy of the sword was quite ordinary. It was neither desolate nor desolate, devoid of lethal intent and devoid of any other energy, as if it were a flying sword that could be seen everywhere. It was extremely simple. Only the likes of Nan Shu and Bai Zhenren could discover that this simplicity was actually the indifference after the complexity had been achieved. This was the so-called returning to the simplicity and returning to the simplicity. The sword light passed through the spot where Nan Shu had been and kept moving forward. The godly swordsman of West Ocean stood in the sky. He had already adjusted his energy to the peak and headed toward the sword light without hesitation. Countless huge tides occurred on the surface of the ocean, and then everything returned to normal. The sword light didn't stop there and flew over. The 12 sections of the heavy building sword were all broken into pieces. The godly swordsman of West Ocean spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. He fell down toward the surface of the ocean while facing the sky. A figure in the upper state of the heavenly arrival state had been wounded severely by a sword. The target of the sword light was not the godly swordsman. It was merely passing by. Witnessing the scene, the people were shocked speechless. Even Bai Zhenren felt a chill in his bones. The sword light didn't stop after knocking the godly swordsman of West Ocean away. In fact, it didn't slow down at all. It kept moving forward. The sky was illuminated by the sword light. The disciples of the Western Sea Sword School fell into the ocean in tandem. Many of them were killed or wounded in an instant. The sword light suddenly entered the ocean and then flew up again, disappearing from the eyes of the people, heading toward the high sky. A moment later, a deep and painful whimper could be heard in the deep part of the ocean. The huge dark shadow was disintegrating slowly. The ocean water was gradually dyed red. Nan Shu had already fled to the high sky. The sword light chased after him. Countless gazes were fixed in that direction. A few moments later, innumerable marks appeared in the sky. Nan Shu was in the front, and the sword light was behind. The speed displayed by Nan Shu was beyond the imagination of the cultivation practitioners. Yet, he still couldn't get rid of this sword. The marks grew fainter and fainter. It meant that Nan Shu and the sword light were getting farther and farther away from the ground, until they couldn't be seen anymore. Yet, nobody pulled back their gazes. They were still looking up at the sky. After a long while, it suddenly rained from the sky. The people knew that Nan Shu was dead. In the barren mountain, Nan Shu looked at the surrounding fields. The ruined temple, the black coffin, and those rocks had all turned into the tiniest powder. It was the result of his and Jing Jiu's swords. The flowers, the trees, the cliff rocks, and the water vapor were all mixed together and couldn't be separated anymore. Nan Shu finally understood the principle. Was this the all-in-one? He thought of it in silence, and then closed his eyes. On the West Ocean, Jing Jiu and Nan Shu stood 100 feet apart in the empty realm. Apart from the grudges between Aoyama and the Foggy Island, they were the two swordsmen who were the closest in terms of sword work in the history of Chaotian. They had a conversation through spiritual awareness in the last moments of their lives. "Are you still you now?" asked Jing Jiu. Nan Shu's pale face showed a hint of bewilderment as he replied, "Of course I am me." "Who is he then?" asked Jing Jiu. "He is him," said Nan Shu. "That's reasonable," said Jing Jiu. "Who are you then?" asked Nan Shu. "The all-in-one." "I'm Jing Yang," replied Jing Jiu. Nan Shu understood what Jing Jiu meant. He said sentimentally while looking at Jing Jiu, "What a marvelous sword, and what a marvelous man." There was a sword in Aoyama that he had always wanted to see, but didn't dare see. There was also a person he had always wanted to see, but didn't dare see. Now that he had seen Nan Shu, it was time for him to go back. His body dissipated into countless light specks, dispersing in all directions. Even the figures in the heavenly arrival state could do so, not to mention that he was a sword ghost to begin with. Jing Jiu's line of sight followed those light specks downward. Those light specks passed through the empty realm and turned into water drops after being stained by the water vapor, which then fell down like raindrops. The raindrops landed on the surface of the ocean, but they didn't create any waves. The surface of the ocean that had been stained red by the whale's blood was as tranquil as ever. The event that had happened 1,000 years ago had come to an end. Seeing this, Jing Jiao felt sentimental, as he remarked, "The wind is calm for a lifetime, and the waves will remain calm for 1,000 years." He forgot that this was the empty realm, devoid of air and sound. It was deathly quiet in heaven and earth. The game of the West Ocean Sword has gone on for more than half. I've written a detailed outline for this part. I calculated it the day before and found that it has more than 60,000 words, including the revisions. Fortunately, the final result is what I wanted. I hope everybody will like it. Chapter 508. The empty realm was windless and soundless. It was as quiet as a graveyard. In the higher sky, there were countless thunderstorms. It seemed that they would fall at any time, but it also seemed that they would never fall. They looked like the eyes of purple, red, and blue monsters, staring at everything below. Jing Jiao looked at his right hand and every part of his body at the same time, confirming that he had undergone some very subtle, or perhaps mysterious, changes. He accepted Lu Si's invitation in a ruined temple on the barren mountain and became the sword that he used to kill Nan Chu and Jian Shalai. As far as he was concerned, he had taken the most important step toward that river. He didn't know what would happen in the future. The questions he posed to the two Nan Chu were answered by Nan Chu in the end. Those were not important. He had never doubted himself. The reason why he had refused Lu Si all these years and was unwilling to take this step was because he was worried about something else. Looking at Xiaoming Island on the surface of the sea, Meng Qi guessed that his senior brother should be on that island, judging from the situation of the Orthodox sects such as Zhongzhou School and Yamatai. Did you plan this beforehand? If he really is that ghost, then you may indeed win this war in the end, but will you still have a chance to enjoy it? As he thought of these things, he looked at a certain spot in the sky, only to find that Lu Si was no longer there. Rain was falling from the sky. The rain was not heavy and stopped after a while. Many cultivators' clothes were not wet. Even if a few drops of rain fell on their faces, no one thought of wiping it off, and no one thought of using a Taoist technique to block the rain. Everyone was still in a state of extreme shock brought about by the sword light. So how could they care about such trivial matters? The sword light came down from the horizon and arrived in the blink of an eye. It wounded the godly swordsmen of West Ocean severely, killed many in an instant, dismembered the flying whale, and killed Nan Chu in the sky. Heaven and earth were opened, and even ghosts and gods had to stay away. No matter what words were used to describe it, it was not enough. What kind of sword was this? How could such a sword exist in this world? The cultivators thought back to their long life of cultivation, recalled the ancient books in a mountain gate, and found that there had never been such a powerful sword. This was probably the most powerful sword in the history of Chaotian. Countless gazes followed the rain back to the arena and landed on perfected Lu Si. Those eyes were filled with awe. That sword was too terrifying, and the person who could unleash it was naturally even more terrifying. Many people recalled what the immortal Lu Si had said to Nan Chu not long ago. "I am the sect master of Aoyama. Of course, I am invincible." Yes. With the sword in his hand, Lu Si was the strongest swordsman in Chaotian. Even the strongest expert in the world would have to consume a great deal of spirit and sword energy to unleash such a strike. Lu Si glanced in the direction of Xiaoming Island and suddenly raised his eyebrows. The wind was blowing. Dark clouds covered the sky. The sword of 12-story building was not the most powerful sword in the world, but the godly swordsman of West Ocean was close to being the most powerful swordsman in the world. When he was taken away from the foggy island in the South Sea by Tianjinren, he was still a teenager. Without a teacher or a sect, he only relied on a few sword books to reach the pinnacle of swordsmanship in just 200 years and founded the Western Sea Sword School. Such a person was certainly outstanding. Under the tremendous pressure from the Aoyama sect, the Western Sea Sword School had survived until today. How many people in the world could do that? Unfortunately, The Taoist name he gave himself was a sword from the west, but he was still no match for a sword that came from beyond the sky. Fortunately, the swordsmen of the Aoyama sect were still in the sword formation of 6 stars at the time, so they had no choice but to watch him return to the fallen Immortal Island after being severely wounded. This was the main island of the Western Sea Sword School, far away from Xiaoming Island. Even if the formation of the mountain gate was destroyed, the defense here would be able to hold on for a while. On the cliff on the east side of the island facing the ocean, there was a huge hole about 1,000 feet wide and 100 feet high. It looked like a huge window through which the rain and wind of the sea could be seen. A white line appeared on the surface of the ocean, and the godly swordsman of West Ocean landed in the window. Turning around, he saw the raindrops falling from the sky, knowing that his master was dead. Now that he thought about it, his master was called the Godly Swordsman of the South Sea. The name of the fallen Immortal Island was indeed not good, and he should have changed it back then. The Godly Swordsman of West Ocean's face was a bit pale, but his expression didn't change. "Is this your scheme?" he asked. A few years ago, the young mysterious Dark Master contacted him through Su Zai, intending to cooperate with him to kill Taiping Jinren. He wasn't good at scheming, and he was aware that such a simple scheme had no chance of succeeding. As such, he got the Zhongzhou school involved in the scheme through Su Zai. According to his original plan, his goal was to kill Taiping Jinren, and then kill that devil and Aoyama together with his master. In order to trick Taiping Jinren into the scheme, he had even sacrificed Tian Jinren's life. Now that his master was dead and the West Ocean was on the verge of being destroyed, the Zhongzhou school hadn't done anything yet. It was obvious what the problem was. No matter how formidable the Aoyama sect's attack on the West Ocean Islands was, and no matter how violent the storm was in the outside world, Su Zai had been staying on the fallen Immortal Island. He was the former young master of the mysterious dark sect and the most talented young man in the deviant sects, but he couldn't cause any trouble in this war. Stirring up trouble was something he had already done before the war started. He had another reason to stay on the fallen Immortal Island. He knew that the godly swordsman of West Ocean would come back and ask him this question. "Yes," Su Zai continued calmly. "All I wanted to do was to kill you. After this event is over, the Zhongzhou school will help the mysterious dark sect find a spiritual source." The godly swordsman of West Ocean reached out his hand and grabbed Su Zai's neck, even though he was a few feet away from him. A sword will shot out from between Su Zai's eyebrows and hit the chest of the godly swordsman of West Ocean. The body of the godly swordsman of West Ocean swayed slightly, and his injury worsened. His Dao tree was on the verge of collapsing. Even if he could escape today, he wouldn't be able to cure his injury without practicing diligently for 100 years, and he had no hope of climbing to the top level of the sword work. This sword was very powerful, formidable, and it had a familiar feeling to him. He remembered that it was Pei Baifa's sword. He thought of Chao Xiaoshu. Back then, Pei Baifa had infused this sword will and the remaining Zhen Yuan into Su Zai's body. It wasn't until now that the power of this sword had finally manifested. Su Zai had waited patiently on the West Ocean Islands for this very moment. All the godly swordsmen of West Ocean needed to do was to activate his will, and Su Zai's head would fall off. Su Zai was waiting for death calmly. Many years ago, he chopped off Pei Baifa's head with his own hands and saw Tong Lu's head floating in the ocean. From that moment on, he had never feared death. It was odd that the godly swordsman of West Ocean didn't kill him. The Zhongzhou school has allowed you to have a spiritual source. It looks like something will happen to Aoyama. The godly swordsman of West Ocean pulled back his hand expressionlessly, turned around, and walked into the deep end of the cave. Nanshu was dead, and the godly swordsman of West Ocean had escaped. The disciples of the Western Sea Sword School had suffered a great number of casualties. The last sword light had crushed all the will to resist. Yet, the battle was not over yet, because Taiping Jinren hadn't been caught yet. Xiaoming Island was sealed in ice, and the dragon-tail inkstone had been suppressing it all along. No matter how capable Taiping Jinren was, he couldn't escape undetected. A sword boat of Aoyama landed on Xiaoming Island. Guanyu Jinren and dozens of disciples of Aoyama were about to land on the island. The swordsmen of the orthodox sects, like the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school, the boat of diligent study of Yamatsai, and the Guoqing temple and the Kunlun sect were watching the scene from a dare. A section of the Black Mountain had been cut off by the godly swordsmen of West Ocean, exposing the smooth and flat stone cliff and the complicated tunnel hidden in it. In the deepest part of the stone room, the great Grand Master of the mysterious dark sect stood behind Yin San. Looking at the young man before him, Yin San didn't say anything, his eyes full of curiosity and bewilderment. It had nothing to do with him, no matter how fierce the fight outside was. The West Ocean was doomed anyway. Nanchu would die by that sword, and that wicked disciple should know what he would do next. All he needed to do now was get the first child sword and leave. Nanchu's method that day, and the sword light coming from the horizon, had inspired him. In all of Chaotian, only Nanchu and that sword could inspire him. After he left the West Ocean with the first child sword, he would try to change the body of the sword. Once he succeeded, he would go to Aoyama and start all over again. A few decades later, after the death of that wicked disciple, he would become the sect master of Aoyama again. He would hold the sheath of the inherited heaven sword in his hand and use that sword to sweep across all of Chaotian, completing his great undertaking. It was a perfect plan. Unfortunately, before the perfect start, he encountered a problem that he did not expect. There was another young man in the room where the first child sword was kept. That person was covered in dust, but his face looked delicate and tender, though the expression in his eyes was rather nonchalant. Insan thought this young man was very similar to himself, and so was Suzai. It was a wonderful thing that two young men who looked like himself had suddenly appeared in the world, but it was not fun at all. Insan said with a faint smile, "You're outstanding." "Thanks for the compliment, immortal," Tong Yin said calmly. He held the green sky mirror with both of his hands. The green sky mirror was aimed at Insan. Whoosh! A flash of white light shot out from the green sky mirror. The white light had a faint golden glow, exuding the purest fairy energy, full of destructive intent. The face of the young, mysterious Dark Master was full of fear. Insan's face was pale under the illumination of the white light. According to the request of the student Huang Agu, the title of this chapter is still the lyrics of the song. End of this chapter. Chapter 509. The world in the green sky mirror had woken up, becoming lively again. Those who had slept for a long time didn't know what had happened. They thought that they had merely slept for a while. The eldest young Master Zhang, who was the only one awake and sleeping, felt uncomfortable about it, but he was aware that he couldn't complain about it. As a result, he moved to a Taoist temple to seek peace and quiet. The juniors of his family and the officials in the county town begged him for many days, but he refused to move back. He woke up one morning and walked to the window, looking down at the bottom of the cliff. He missed the talking carp in the well. Suddenly, his eyelids were burned by the fire. What he saw was not a real fire, but a burning cloud. The morning glow appeared in the sky, many times brighter than usual, as if it contained a great deal of light and heat, ready to erupt at any moment. Seeing this scene, the eldest young Master Zhang felt it rather eerie, feeling alarmed for no reason. Flutter! Flutter! The blue bird flew over from afar and landed on a tree branch by the Taoist temple. Looking at the morning glow, a hint of sadness appeared in his bewildered eyes. It was not the regular morning glow, but the true fairy glow. The fairy glow filling the sky was a sign that the fairy book would come out. The fairy book in the green sky mirror had been taken by Jingjiu a long time ago. Why was there another fairy book? The white light shooting out from the green sky mirror came from that fairy book. Only the Zhongzhou school had the fairy book in the world. In addition to the fairy awareness, the fairy book also contained a great deal of fairy energy. In order to temper that fairy book, Jingjiu had listened to the scripts in the Guoqing temple for a few years, and he had almost had a mishap. Guidong was still in a deep sleep after the fairy energy poured into her body. Yet, all the fairy energy in the fairy book had been released in an instant. It was easy to imagine how powerful it would be. Illuminated by the fairy light, Insan's face grew paler and paler, almost turning transparent. His hands turned transparent as well. It was unclear if his body under the cloth was the same. The strong wind whistled in the stone room, passing through the bone flute, making a whimpering sound that sounded like the wailing of ghosts. With a soft hum, the celestial light landed on his body. His clothes were torn into pieces, fluttering like butterflies, and then turned into nothingness. Insan didn't disappear like a butterfly. He was still standing in the same place. It was unknown what kind of divine art he used, but the immortal light actually passed through his body. The celestial light landed on the wall of the stone chamber, instantly burning and corroding a large hole. Then, a trace of power leaked out. With a loud bang, the stone chamber collapsed, and the rocks above were lifted off, revealing the sky covered in dark clouds. Cultivators of various sects surrounded the Xiaoming Island, watching the Aoyama sword boat that was about to land with various emotions. The flattened mountain on Xiaoming Island suddenly exploded. A beam of immortal light soared into the sky. Countless gravel and gales howled in all directions. The sword boat of Aoyama was the first to bear the brunt of the impact. Many cracks appeared on it instantly. Guanyin Jinren wielded his sword and brought the disciples of Aoyama back to the boat. The cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school and the boat of diligent study of Yamatai quaked violently. The flying sedans of other sects had almost fallen off the boat. They flew to the distance hastily. Countless gazes fell on the collapsed mountain and saw the scene in the dilapidated stone room. The fairy light came from the green sky mirror in Tong Yan's hand. Insan's face was pale. It was evident that he had suffered an irreversible injury. The Thunder Soul would have experienced the thunderbolts on the top of Bihu Peak for a great many years. He was reborn with the help of the Thunder Soul Wood and learned the related magic. By employing the method of passing through the thunder, the fairy light had barely passed through his body and prevented all the power of the fairy energy from reaching his body. As a result, he was brushed by the fairy light. Yet it was the fairy light. Not everybody could withstand it, even if it was merely brushed by the fairy light lightly. Moreover, the fairy book prepared by the Zhongzhou school for him wouldn't be lost so easily. The real lethal attack was yet to come. As the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect was about to take Insan away, he suddenly looked at the sky and screamed strangely. He turned around and fled, arriving a few thousand feet away in an instant. After the fairy light left Xiaoming Island, it didn't dissipate, nor did it grow fainter. Instead, it disappeared into the dense dark clouds in the sky. Above the dark clouds was the empty realm, and above the empty realm was the thunder region. The whirlpools of thunder and lightning looked like countless colorful eyes, watching everything in the human world. The fairy light was like a tinder, igniting the angry flames in those eyes. The dark clouds were rolling restlessly, and countless bolts of lightning flashed in the sky. Along with the booming sounds, countless balls of thunder and fire shot toward the ground, heading toward Xiaoming Island. Countless huge waves formed on the surface of the ocean. The cultivation practitioners of various sects moved away in tandem, their faces full of fear. The power of the thunder and fire was unimaginably powerful, almost as powerful as the heavenly punishment. It was no wonder that the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect, a demonic god, was so fearful. Looking at the thunder and fire descending from the sky, Insan thought he would die soon. Though he had many other tricks up his sleeves, they were useless against this patch of thunder and fire. The fairy light didn't kill him immediately after passing through his body, but it left a mark in his body. No matter where he fled to, this patch of thunder and fire would eventually land on him. It was not like the heavenly punishment. This was the heavenly punishment. The corners of Insan's mouth curled up slightly, flashing a self-mocking smile. Back when he came back from the underworld, He had made a vow that he would not undergo the heavenly punishment in his life unless the world was at peace. Unexpectedly, it was the heavenly punishment that found him in the end. Was this the so-called heavenly punishment? The situation at the West Ocean had been under his control. As Jingjiu had taken that step, Nanchu would be defeated for sure, and Jingjiu would no longer be a threat to him, and he would become the sword in his hand. By then, he would be able to fulfill all his vow. Unexpectedly, he had come to the last moment. There were so many things he hadn't done yet. He had promised the king of the underworld, promised himself, and how this world could exist forever. He, of course, was not satisfied with the result. As San was waiting for his death, a tall figure suddenly appeared in front of him. That person raised his palm to block the thunder and fire descending from the sky. Looking at the back of that person, San arched his eyebrows slightly. It was he who had stood in front of that person a few hundred years ago, but it was the other way around now. And since when did that person become taller than him? Countless thunder and fire descended from the sky. A single leaf could cover a large mountain, and a single palm could cover the entire sky, including the thunder and fire in the sky. The scorching rays of light spread out in the sky above Xiaoming Island. The thunder boomed and rumbled incessantly, but none of them landed on the ground. After a long while, the thunder had finally stopped. The dark clouds dispersed, exposing the blue sky. It was unclear where the terrifying thunder and fire had gone, as they didn't leave any trace in heaven and earth. Lu Xi pulled back his palm. He leaped into the sky without turning around to take a look at San. 15 sword boats of Aoyama were scattered in the sky. The disciples of Aoyama on the boats looked at the figure of the immortal sect master, their faces full of worry. The immortal sect master had killed Nanchu, countless disciples of the West Ocean, and the flying whale with a swing of his sword. He looked like a god, but he had collected the heavenly thunder. Would he be all right? It was then that Lu Xi's body suddenly swayed a bit. Hundreds of flying swords of Aoyama had flown toward Xiaoming Island, and they were heading toward Tongyan. This was a reflexive action of the disciples of Aoyama. The situation was too chaotic. Many people couldn't figure out why Tongyan of the Center Sect was on Xiaoming Island and what the fairy light was all about. Why did the immortal Lu Xi show up there when the thunder and fire were about to crush Taiping Jinren to death? All the disciples of Aoyama knew was that the fairy light had attracted countless heavenly thunders and wounded their immortal sect master, and the cause of all this was Tongyan. Seeing the heavenly thunder vanish, the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect returned to San's side. He was very close to Tongyan, so he could kill him at any moment. Hundreds of sword lights arrived, and the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect was nearby. It seemed that Tongyan would die for sure. Even though there were swordsmen like Bai Zhenren on the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school, they wouldn't have enough time to rescue her. Unexpectedly, Tongyan had suddenly disappeared from the ruins. In the next moment, he appeared on the cloud boat. Nobody sensed that Tongyan had moved. Even the escape method of heaven and earth couldn't break through the sword formation of the Aoyama sect and come to such a distant place in an instant. What method had he employed? Some cultivation practitioners who had participated in the cultivation tournament in the Snowland that year, or had heard of the story of Lo Huainan, recalled the peculiar treasure of the Zhongzhou school, the seal of 10,000 miles. Many cultivation practitioners had guessed that this was a scheme devised by the Zhongzhou school. But what had Tongyan done? With a fairy light and the heavenly thunder, the rumored fairy book? You've worked hard over the last few years. Bai Zhenren shot a glance at Tongyan. Tongyan fell silent. Back when he was attacked by Wang Xiaoming with the sun banner on the cold mountain, he had thought of using the seal of 10,000 miles, but he had refrained from doing so in the end. It had saved his life that day. See Chapter 20 for details. What he didn't expect was that the people of the Aoyama sect intended to kill him without even giving him a chance to speak. What he didn't expect was that when Taiping Jinren was on the verge of being killed, it was the immortal Lu Xi who came forward. Xiaoming Island had turned into ruins. San uttered, after shooting a glance at Lu Xi in the sky. It was unclear what emotion he was feeling at the moment. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect came before him hastily and bowed down. Insen lay on the ground, feeling a bit weak. Crack! A crack appeared on the ground. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect arrived on the icy surface outside Xiaoming Island with Jing Jiao on his back. He was Taiping Jinren, whom the whole world wanted to kill. Now that all the orthodox cultivation sects had gathered here, how could he escape? The immortal Lu Xi had taken the fairy book prepared for him by the Zhongzhou school. But what about the others? A crisp whistle burst out in the sky. Bu Xiao, who had been preparing silently for a long time, drove the dragon-tail inkstone and threw it forward. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect knew that this was the most precious treasure of Yamatsai's temple, so he dared not neglect it. He threw his fists at the inkstone along with a wisp of dark smoke. A deep and low dragon roar came out of the dragon-tail inkstone. The light scattered in all directions, dispersing the dark smoke in an instant. Boom! Countless cracks appeared on the icy surface around Xiaoming Island, spreading out like a spider web. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect swayed slightly, but soon steadied himself. He carried Insan on his back and kept moving forward. The dragon-tail inkstone rose up into the sky and was about to strike down again. Bu Xiao was suddenly alarmed. In the next moment, a cold and brilliant sword light appeared in front of his eyes. Guan Yuanjinren looked at him in silence. Bu Xiao stared at him, saying nothing. Seeing this scene, people were shocked again. In the boat of diligent study, Lu Shui was even more perplexed. Back in the Guoqing temple, he met that senior monk. Later, he learned that he was an enemy of his young master, so Zhao Liu asked him to go and kill him. So he went. Even though he knew that the opponent was the great Grandmaster Taiping, he didn't hesitate because he believed in his young master, so the opponent must be a bad person. But why were the immortal sect master and Guan Yuan Jinren stopping others from killing him today? Excellent, excellent. The senior monks from the instruction hall of the Guoqing temple flew up. They knew that they were no match for the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect. But today, the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect was shocked by the fairy book and hit by the dragon tail inkstone. He was in low spirits, so the senior monks decided to buy him some time and wait for other orthodox swordsmen to come to his aid, even at the cost of their lives. Sorry. The newcomer didn't speak like this because he was afraid or nervous, but because he had a stutter. Mo Chi led his fellow disciples from unknown peaks and blocked the way of these senior monks. Among the 9 peaks of Aoyama, Elder Mo Chi of Tianguang Peak was famous for his ugly face and gentle temperament. At this moment, his eyes were still warm, but his expression was firm. In the sea and sky around Xiaoming Island, the sword light was chaotic. The 2 Aoyama sword boats where the disciples of Liangwang Peak were parked a little farther away. Guananshan, Guhan, and the others were even more confused. The situation was so chaotic that they didn't understand what was going on, nor did they receive any orders from their masters. The immortal sect master stood in the sky and didn't give any orders. It seemed that he would let the masters of the peaks decide by themselves. Some elders stayed in the sword boats, looking at the figure getting farther and farther away with complicated expressions. Some teachers flew out on their swords to stop the cultivators of the various sections. It wasn't until the cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school moved slightly and Bai Jinren leaped up with the wind that Lu Xi shot a meaningful glance at her. The confrontations were going on everywhere, and nobody paid any attention to him. He Wei, the sect master of Kunlun, thought this was the best opportunity. He yelled at the demon swordsmen not to flee, and then chased after them. The cold signal bird traveled at a high speed. Soon, it had arrived a few miles behind the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect. Leaning against the back of the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect, Insan didn't turn his head around. A ferocious screech suddenly burst out in the sky. The dark phoenix flew over from nowhere. His tail pierced through the sky like a sword. pushing He Wei and the cold signal bird onto the icy surface. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect leaped up into the sky with Een San on his back. The dark phoenix arrived in an instant. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect landed on the back of the dark phoenix. The dark phoenix flapped his wings and flew toward the deep part of the ocean at an unimaginable speed. After being sneak attacked by Nan Shu, Yuan Qijing had used the ice mirror to block Nan Shu's sword head-on in order to protect Zhuoruzhui. As a result, Yuan Qijing had been silent for a long time after being severely wounded. It wasn't until then that his cold and solemn voice rang out again. "Kill him." Only he and Lu Xi knew that this statement was meant for Jing Jiao. The life board of the Dark Phoenix was in Jing Jiao's hand. If the Dark Phoenix were killed now, the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect would have a hard time taking Taiping Zhenren away, no matter how formidable he was. Yet, nothing had happened. The Dark Phoenix flew faster and faster, disappearing from people's sight. The confrontation in the sky had no need to continue. Countless gazes were fixed on the deep part of the ocean. That person didn't turn his head around, regardless of whether it was Yamatai's dragon tail inkstone, the instruction hall of the Guoqing Temple, or He Wei's pursuit. All he did was lean against the back of the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect in silence. He was severely wounded by the fairy book of the Zhongzhou school and was extremely weak, but he still didn't take the pursuit of the swordsman in the world seriously, and he left on the back of the Dark Phoenix in a carefree and unrestrained manner. He was so calm and confident and had an extraordinary bearing. He didn't look like a demon at all. He looked more like a ferryman. Looking at the sword lights in the sky, Zhao Leiyu's face turned pale. She didn't strike because her cultivation state was not high enough and her mind was in a mess. If she stepped forward, it would be an indication of the attitude of the Shinma Peak. Yet, she didn't think she was qualified to do so. Yuan Shu, Ping Yongka, and those disciples of Shuriwei Peak who were responsible for driving the boats were shocked to the extreme, and they didn't know what to say with their mouths wide open. Jing Jiao walked to her side and looked at the sky. Zhao Leiyu had already guessed what had happened. Thinking of Jing Jiao's identity, she asked worriedly, "Are you all right?" Jing Jiao remained silent while looking at the deep part of the ocean. He had been searching for the ghosts in Aoyama. Of course, he knew there were more than 2 or 3 of them, but he didn't expect there to be so many of them. An idea suddenly occurred to Jing Jiao that he was the real ghost in the eyes of these people. End of this chapter. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.